Ethan Walker slid the divorce papers across the white tablecloth and smiled like a man handing out a favor. "I'm not doing this because I hate you, Claire. I'm doing it because you don't fit anymore. Look at you. Look at where we are." He tapped the pen against the crystal glass. "Sign it. You'll be comfortable. You'll be taken care of. But my world needs a woman who belongs in it." He didn't lower his voice. He wanted the whole restaurant to hear how generous he was being. What Ethan Walker did not know was that the quiet woman across from him owned worlds he couldn't even imagine. Before we go on, if a story about arrogance meeting its reckoning is the kind of story you love, take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Stay with me all the way to the end, because the truth about Claire does not come out the way anyone expects. And do me a small favor. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it means the world to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The restaurant was called Lumiere, and it sat 40 stories above Manhattan, the kind of place where a single dinner cost more than most people earned in a month. Ethan had chosen it on purpose. He wanted the ending of his marriage to happen somewhere beautiful, somewhere that reminded him of everything he'd become. Below them, the city glittered like scattered diamonds, and Ethan Walker, 34 years old, founder of Walker Innovations, the man the magazines were calling the next great genius of American technology, leaned back in his chair and felt nothing but relief. Across from him, Claire Bennett had not touched her wine. She wore a navy dress she'd owned for 6 years, and her hair was pulled back the way she always wore it when she wasn't sure whether she'd be asked to stay or leave. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was looking at the pen he'd pushed toward her, and then she was looking at him, and something in her eyes made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't have said why. "You're staring," Ethan said. "Say something." "What would you like me to say, Ethan?" "I don't know. Anything. Yell at me, cry, throw the wine in my face." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "That's what a normal woman would do." "And you'd like me to be normal now." The comment landed somewhere he didn't expect, and for a second, the smile flickered. "Don't twist my words. I'm being honest with you, more honest than most men would be. I could have done this through lawyers. I could have had you served at that little house in Boston. Instead, I brought you here. I'm giving you dignity." "Dignity," Claire repeated softly. "That's what this is." "Yes." "You're divorcing me at a table where a bottle of water costs $18 and you're calling it dignity." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You always do this. You take something simple and you make it complicated. This is why it doesn't work, Claire. This is exactly why. My life moves fast now. There are investors, board members, world leaders. I stand in rooms with people who shape the entire economy, and when they turn to me and say, 'Where's your wife?' I have to point to you." He gestured at her at the navy dress at the tied-back hair. "And you say nothing. You stand in the corner. You disappear." "Maybe I disappear because no one at those parties ever asked me a single question. Because you give them nothing to ask about." The words came out harder than he'd meant them to, and Ethan saw her flinch just slightly, just enough. He felt a flash of something that might have been guilt, but he pushed it down. Guilt was for weak men, and Ethan Walker had spent 5 years teaching himself not to be weak. A waiter approached, sensed the temperature of the table, and retreated without a word. "You remember the apartment on Fillmore Street?" Claire asked. "Don't." "The heater that only worked if you kicked it, the mattress on the floor. You used to say the crack in the ceiling looked like the coast of California." "I said a lot of stupid things back then. You used to hold my hand under the covers and tell me that one day the whole world was going to know your name, and that when it happened, you'd never forget who was there when it didn't." Ethan looked away toward the window, toward the lights. "People change, Claire. That's not a crime. I grew. I evolved. You stayed exactly where you were." He turned back to her. "And I can't build an empire married to the past." For a long moment, Claire said nothing. Then she reached out, and instead of taking the pen, she picked up the divorce agreement itself and began to read it, slowly, line by line. Ethan watched her drumming his fingers, growing impatient. "You don't need to read the whole thing," he said. "My lawyers already went through it. It's fair. More than fair." "I'd like to read it anyway. It's 12 pages. "Then I suppose you'll have to be patient." She read, and as she read, her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy checking his phone, replying to a message from Victoria, who was waiting for him in a lounge 2 blocks away, who had texted him a single word. "Done," he typed back. "Almost." Then he set the phone face down and looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife reading the terms of her own quiet dismissal, and he felt absurdly proud of himself. He had thought of everything. That was the thing about Ethan Walker. He always thought of everything. The agreement stated in careful legal language that each party would retain their separate property. Walker Innovations, the company, every share, every asset acquired during the marriage, all of it would remain his. Claire would receive a settlement generous by ordinary standards, along with the modest house outside Boston that they'd bought in the early years and rarely used. There was one clause his lawyers had insisted on, a standard protection, meant to shield his growing fortune from any future claim. It read simply, "Each party's assets, whether held before, during, or after the marriage, shall remain solely and permanently their own." Ethan had read that clause a dozen times and smiled every time. It protected everything he had built. It walled off his billion-dollar company from the woman he was leaving behind. He had no idea he was building a wall around the wrong fortune. "You've thought about this a great deal," Claire said, setting the papers down. "I told you, nothing but respect. This clause here," she tapped it lightly, "each party's assets remain solely their own. You're very proud of that one, aren't you?" "My lawyers are. It's ironclad." "Ironclad," she echoed, and there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth so slight that Ethan mistook it for resignation. "You're right. It is." She picked up the pen, and Ethan in that moment felt the purest satisfaction he had ever known. Not when the first investor wired the money. Not when the company crossed $1 billion in valuation. Not when the magazine put his face on the cover with the word genius printed underneath. No. This was the peak. Watching the woman who no longer fit his life sign herself out of it quietly, without a fight, exactly the way he'd planned. "Thank you, Claire," he said, and he almost meant it. "You're making this easier than I expected." "I've found out," she said, "that fighting people who have already made up their minds is a waste of a good evening." She signed, Claire Bennett. The pen moved smoothly across the line, and it was done. 10 years of marriage ended over a dinner she hadn't ordered in a restaurant she would never return to. Ethan reached across and took the papers before the ink had fully dried, as if she might change her mind, as if she might snatch them back. He tucked them into the leather folder his lawyer had provided and exhaled. "You'll get the settlement within 30 days. The house is already in your name. There's nothing else to sort out." "No," Claire agreed. "There's nothing else." She stood. She smoothed the navy dress. She looked at him one last time, and Ethan expected to see tears, or anger, or the pleading he'd braced himself against. Instead, he saw something he had no word for, something calm and clear and almost gentle, the look of a person watching someone else make a mistake they would spend the rest of their life regretting. "Goodbye, Ethan," Claire said. "Goodbye, Claire. I do wish you well. I hope you know that." "I know exactly what you wish." She turned toward the door. Then she paused, and without looking back, she said one more thing so quietly he almost missed it. "You were a good man once. I hope you find him again someday. You'll need him." And then she was gone, threading through the tables past the men in their tailored suits and the women in their diamonds, none of whom gave the woman in the plain navy dress a second glance. Ethan watched her disappear into the elevator. He waited for regret. It didn't come. He picked up his phone and typed one word to Victoria Dunn. What Ethan Walker did not know, could not possibly have known, was that the woman who had just signed his divorce papers had not been born Claire Bennett at all. Her name, her true name, the name printed on a passport, locked in a safe deposit box in a bank her family had owned for 3 generations, was Claire Whitmore Sinclair. And the Sinclair name was not a small thing. It was one of the oldest and largest private fortunes in America, a dynasty that had been quietly moving the machinery of banks and shipping lines and global markets since before Ethan Walker's grandfather was born. The Sinclairs did not appear on magazine covers. They did not chase headlines. They owned the companies that everyone else fought over. And Claire was not a distant cousin or a minor branch of the family. She was the sole heir, every dollar, every holding, every share. The woman Ethan Walker had just dismissed as an embarrassment was on paper and in blood worth more than his entire industry combined. But the story is stranger and crueler than even that, and to understand it we have to go back. Back before Lumiere, before the magazine covers, before Ethan Walker had learned to be ashamed of the woman who loved him. We have to go back to the beginning, to a cold apartment on Fillmore Street, where a struggling programmer stood in front of a dying company, and a woman who had already decided to save him without ever telling him how. 5 years earlier, Ethan Walker had been nobody. He'd had a laptop, a folder full of rejected pitches, and an idea he believed in with the desperate faith of a man who had nothing else to believe in. Walker Innovations at that point was 3 employees, a leased office the size of a closet and a bank balance that turned red at the end of every month. He had gone to 17 investors. 17. And 17 times he had walked out of glass conference rooms with the same polite, devastating word ringing in his ears. Interesting. We'll be in touch. They were never in touch. They laughed at me today, he told Claire one night sitting on the floor of the apartment because they'd sold the couch to make rent. Not out loud, but I saw it. The way the one guy looked at the other guy, like I was wasting their time. You're not wasting anyone's time, Ethan. You have to say that. You're my wife. I don't have to say anything. Claire sat down beside him on the floor, close as her shoulder against his. I'm saying it because it's true. What you're building matters. I've watched you work on it for 2 years. I've seen you solve problems that made grown men give up. They're not laughing at you because you're wrong. They're laughing because they can't see it yet. That's their failure, not yours. Ethan had leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. We have 11 days, Claire. 11 days of payroll left, and then it's over. I let 3 people down. I let you down. You haven't let me down. I sold your mother's ring. The room went quiet. It was the thing they hadn't talked about. The thing he'd done 2 weeks earlier when the electricity was about to be cut off, when he'd taken the small velvet box out of the drawer and driven to a pawn shop on Mission Street and come back with just enough cash to keep the lights on and just enough shame to last a lifetime. I know, Claire said softly. I'll get it back. I swear to you, Claire, the day this works, the very first thing I do. Ethan? She took his face in her hands and made him look at her. It's a ring. It's metal and a stone. I married you, not a ring. Do you understand me? There is nothing in that pawn shop that matters more than the man sitting next to me on this floor. Nothing. He'd cried then. It was the last time in 5 years he would let himself cry, though he didn't know it at the time. And Claire had held him, and over his shoulder, staring at the crack in the ceiling that he swore looked like the coast of California, she had made a decision. She would save him, but she would never let him know. Because Claire Whitmore. Sinclair understood something about the man she loved that the man himself did not yet understand. Ethan Walker did not want to be helped. He wanted to earn. He wanted to build something with his own hands and stand on top of it and say, look, I did this myself. And if he ever found out that his wife came from a fortune older than the country's railroads, if he ever learned that a single phone call from her could solve every problem, he lay awake at night, dreading it would break something in him. It would take the one thing he had, his pride, his belief in his own 2 hands, and it would poison it forever. So she said nothing. The next morning, while Ethan was at the office trying to squeeze 1 more week out of a dying budget, Claire made a phone call. She had not called that number in nearly 3 years. Not since she'd walked away from the Sinclair name, from the drivers and the estates, and the expectation that she would one day sit at the head of a boardroom she'd never asked to inherit. She had wanted just once to be loved as a person, and not as an heiress. So she had become Claire Bennett, a quiet woman with a librarian's wardrobe and a fake, forgettable history, and she had met a broke, brilliant, kind-hearted programmer at a coffee shop who had no idea, none at all, that the woman correcting his spreadsheet formulas could have bought the entire building they were sitting in. But love was one thing. Watching him drown was another. Northbridge Capital, a crisp voice answered. How may I direct your call? This is Claire Sinclair. I need to speak with Mr. Halloran. Tell him it's the chairman's daughter. Tell him it's urgent. There was a long pause, and then a scramble, and then a man's voice, warm and astonished. Miss Sinclair, my God, we thought your father said you needed time. We never, of course. Of course. Anything. What do you need? Northbridge Capital was one of dozens of investment arms buried inside the Sinclair empire, a firm most people had never heard of precisely because the Sinclairs preferred it that way. Quiet money. Patient money. Money that moved into a company through 5 layers of holding structures so that no one, not even the founder, could trace it back to a single name. There's a company, Claire said. Walker Innovations. Small, struggling, about to fail. I want you to fund it. How much are we talking? Whatever it takes. Get me a full picture of what they need to not just survive but grow, then give them more than that. But Mr. Halloran listened to me very carefully because this is the entire point of the call. She paused. The founder can never know it was me. Not the family, not the Sinclair name, not my involvement in any way. As far as Ethan Walker is concerned, a group of impressed private investors saw his potential and took a chance on him. That's the story. That's the only story. If he ever learns the truth, you'll have failed me completely. Do you understand? I understand, Miss Sinclair, but may I ask why? Because Claire said, and her voice was very quiet, he needs to believe he did it himself. It's the only gift I can give him that he'll actually let himself keep. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Ethan Walker walked out of a glass conference room in a completely different frame of mind. He'd taken a meeting he almost canceled with a firm he'd never heard of, expecting the 18th polite rejection of his life. Instead, a soft-spoken man named Halloran had listened to his entire pitch, asked 3 sharp questions, and then slid a term sheet across the table with a number on it that made Ethan's vision blur. He had run all the way back to the apartment, actually run up 4 flights of stairs, and burst through the door where Claire was heating soup on the stove. Claire! He was laughing and gasping at the same time. They said yes. They said yes. Northbridge Capital. They're funding the whole thing, the whole round. They're giving us more than I even asked for. Ethan, that's wonderful. They believe in it, Claire. Someone finally believes in it. He grabbed her and spun her around the tiny kitchen soup, forgotten, and she laughed with him, and if there were tears in her eyes, he mistook them for joy, which they were, though not for the reason he thought. I did it, he kept saying. I did it. All those people who laughed, and I did it. You did it, Claire said, holding him. You did it, my love. It was always going to be you. And that lie, the one she told with her whole heart, was the greatest gift she would ever give him, and the one he would come to repay with the cruelest words of his life. The money changed everything, and at first it changed everything for the better. Walker Innovations hired. It grew. The product Ethan had built in a closet found its market, and then it found a bigger one. And within 18 months, the company that 17 investors had laughed at was being written about in the same magazines that had ignored its founders' emails. Ethan worked harder than he had ever worked. Claire would give him that always. He was not lazy. He was not stupid. The product was genuinely his. The vision was his. The relentless 80-hour weeks were his. It was only the runway beneath it all, the invisible ground he was running on that belonged to someone else. And because he never knew about the runway, he came to believe he had built the sky itself. That was where it started. The slow, quiet turning of a good man into someone Claire no longer recognized. At first it was small things. He bought a suit that cost more than they used to spend in 3 months. Claire said nothing because he'd earned it, hadn't he? Then he bought a watch, then a car. He started staying later at the office, then started staying out after the office at dinners with investors at parties in the hills, in rooms full of people who spoke a language of money and status that Ethan learned with terrifying speed. You could come tonight, he told her once in the early days of the change. There's a thing at the Fairmont, investors, you should meet them. I'd love to. But when she arrived, dressed simply because simple was who she was, she watched something happen to Ethan's face that she would never forget. She watched him look at her, and then look at the room, and then look at her again, and she watched a small, ugly calculation flicker behind his eyes. She was underdressed. She was quiet. She didn't sparkle the way the other men's wives sparkled. And for the first time in their marriage, Ethan Walker was embarrassed by her. He didn't say it. Not that night. But she saw it. And Claire had spent her whole life reading rooms full of powerful people, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. Did I do something wrong tonight? She asked him in the car home. No, of course not. You seemed uncomfortable when I was talking to Mr. Abernathy. You were talking to him about libraries, Claire. He asked what I liked to do. I told him. These people don't care about libraries. They care about... He stopped himself. It doesn't matter. Forget it. But it did matter. It mattered more and more with every passing month. The parties grew grander, and the distance between them grew wider, and Ethan stopped inviting her, and then stopped mentioning the parties at all, and Claire found herself alone in a beautiful house they'd bought in rooms. She rattled around in, married to a man who came home smelling of expensive scotch and other people's ambition. And there was Victoria. Claire knew about Victoria long before Ethan thought she did. Victoria Hayes had joined Walker Innovations as its marketing director, and she was everything Ethan had begun to think he wanted. Polished, ambitious, beautiful in the sharp, expensive way of a woman who had made herself into a weapon aimed at exactly the kind of man Ethan was becoming. She laughed at his jokes in front of the board. She stood close to him in photographs. She understood the language of status because she was fluent in it, and she looked at Ethan Walker, not the way Claire looked at him with the deep, patient love of someone who'd known him when he was broke and frightened, but the way a climber looks at a mountain, seeing not the man, but the altitude he could provide. "Victoria thinks we should host the launch event at the Getty," Ethan mentioned one night, not looking up from his phone. "Victoria has a lot of thoughts about your company." Now he looked up. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing. It means she has a lot of thoughts. That's her job, isn't it?" "You don't like her." "I don't know her, Ethan. You've never invited me anywhere she is." He'd set his jaw and gone back to his phone, and Claire had looked at the top of his bent head and felt something inside her quietly finally begin to grieve. Not for the marriage as it was, for the marriage as it had been on a cold floor on Fillmore Street, when a frightened young man had cried in her arms and sworn he'd never forget who was there when it didn't work. He had forgotten. That was the truth of it. Success hadn't corrupted Ethan Walker so much as it had revealed him, or maybe it had done both at once, the way pressure both crushes coal and makes diamonds. And what had emerged was a man who genuinely, sincerely believed that his wife was beneath the life he had built, the life she had built for him, the life he was standing on without ever knowing it. For a long time, Claire told herself it would pass. Men lost themselves sometimes in the early rush of money and found themselves again. She waited. She was patient. She had promised herself when she married him that she would love him through the hard times, and she'd assumed the hard times would be poverty. It had never occurred to her that the hardest time would be wealth. Then came the night that ended it. Not the divorce dinner. That was just the paperwork. The real ending came a month before at a gala for a children's hospital, one of the rare events he'd let her attend because his PR team thought a devoted wife made for good optics. She'd been standing near the bar when she overheard him. He didn't know she was there. He was talking to two other founders, and one of them had made some joke about their wives, and Ethan, laughing, holding a glass of champagne worth more than their first month's rent, had said the words that Claire would carry with her for the rest of her life. Claire, God, she's a good woman, don't get me wrong, but she's like the training wheels, you know. You need them at the start, but at some point you take them off or you never actually learn to ride. The other men had laughed, and Ethan had laughed with them, and Claire had set down her drink, walked to the coat check, retrieved her coat and taken a taxi home alone, and somewhere on the freeway, staring out at the passing lights, Claire Whitmore. Sinclair had finally quietly let the marriage go. Training wheels, 10 years, every sacrifice. Her mother's ring, the phone call to Northbridge, the lie she told with her whole heart so he could feel like a self-made man. Training wheels. She didn't cry. She was past crying by then. She simply understood with the terrible clarity of a woman who has finally stopped hoping that the man she'd married was gone and the man wearing his face would never ever look at her and see anything but a burden he'd outgrown. So when Ethan came to her a month later and told her gently, generously over an $18 bottle of water that he needed a wife who could stand beside CEOs and world leaders, Claire was not surprised. She had already begun making arrangements, not for revenge. She wanted the world to understand that. She had never, not once, wanted revenge. She only wanted to be free. But freedom for a woman like Claire was a complicated thing because freedom meant returning to the name she'd left behind. And the moment Claire Whitmore Sinclair stepped back into her own life, the machinery of an empire she'd been avoiding for years would begin slowly and inevitably to turn. And that machinery did not care about Ethan Walker's feelings. It did not know his story. It only knew that the sole heir to the Sinclair fortune was involved with a company called Walker Innovations, funded, though almost no one alive knew it, by a Sinclair subsidiary called Northbridge Capital. Ethan had built his empire on borrowed ground, and the woman who owned that ground had just been told in front of two laughing strangers that she was training wheels. He had no idea what he had done. He had no idea what was coming. He was at that very moment sitting in a lounge 2 blocks from Lumiere, clinking glasses with Victoria Hayes, telling her it was finally, officially over. To new beginnings, Victoria said, her eyes bright, her ambition barely disguised as affection. To new beginnings, Ethan agreed. God, Vic, I feel light, like I put down something I'd been carrying for years. She didn't make a scene. Claire, no. She never makes a scene. She just sat there and signed. Honestly, part of me almost wishes she'd fought a little. It would have made me feel like I mattered to her. You matter to everyone now, Ethan. Victoria touched his hand. You're going to be the biggest name in this whole city, and you're going to have the right woman beside you when it happens. He smiled. He believed her. He believed all of it the same way he'd believed 17 investors were wrong and one was right, without ever asking himself why the one had been so willing when all the others walked away. That was Ethan's great flaw, the flaw that would cost him everything. He never asked why the good things happened. He only ever asked why the bad things did. Across town, in a bank building her family had owned since 1911, Claire stood in a private vault while a manager who addressed her as Miss Sinclair opened a safe deposit box with a key that had waited 3 years for her return. Inside was a passport, a set of documents, and a single photograph of a man with silver hair and kind, tired eyes standing in front of a shipping container with a young girl on his shoulders. Her father, Richard Sinclair, the chairman of Sinclair International Holdings. The man Ethan believed, because Claire had told him so, was a retired mechanic living quietly in Ohio. Claire picked up the passport and looked at her own name, her real name, in the small photograph. She hadn't been this person in a long time. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be her. "Will you be needing anything else, Miss Sinclair?" the manager asked. "No, thank you." She closed the box. "Actually, yes. One thing. I'd like a meeting arranged with my father." "Of course. Shall I tell him what it concerns?" Claire looked at the photograph one more time before she slid it into her bag. When she spoke, her voice was steady and calm and carried the quiet weight of a decision that could not be undone. "Tell him," she said, "that his daughter is coming home, and tell him to have Mr. Halloran pull every file on a company called Walker Innovations, every loan, every share, every clause of every contract. I want to know exactly what we own." "Right away, Miss Sinclair." She walked out of the vault, out of the bank, into the cold, bright evening, and she did not look back. She was not the woman who had signed those divorce papers anymore. She had let that woman go too, along with the marriage, along with the man, along with the 10 years, and the mother's ring, and the phone call, and the lie told with her whole heart. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Walker raised a glass to his future and toasted the beginning of his empire. He did not know that the empire had never been his. He did not know that the woman he'd called training wheels held the deed to the ground he stood on. He did not know that in exactly 1 week, a man from Northbridge Capital would walk into his conference room with a look of terror on his face and 3 words that would begin the unraveling of everything. "We have a problem." But that was a week away. Tonight, Ethan Walker was happy. Tonight, he was certain he had won. He clinked his glass against Victoria's and laughed, and the sound of that laugh, so pleased with itself, so blind, so sure, rose up into the Manhattan night and vanished unheard into a city that had no idea it was about to watch the fastest fall it had seen in a generation. Claire got into a car that was waiting for her, a car she hadn't ordered, but that had somehow known to be there, because that was how the Sinclair world worked, quietly, invisibly, always 3 steps ahead. The driver was an older man with steady hands, and he caught her eye in the mirror. "Welcome back, Miss Sinclair," he said gently. "We've missed you." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Whitmore. Sinclair let herself lean back against the seat and close her eyes, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for years finally slowly began to loosen. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "It's good to be home." The car pulled into traffic. The city slid past the windows. And though Claire didn't know it yet, and Ethan certainly didn't, the two of them were now moving in opposite directions along a single thread of fate. One rising, one about to fall. Connected by a company neither of them had ever really owned alone, bound by a marriage that was over on paper, and by a debt of 10 years that no divorce agreement could ever settle. Ethan believed he had cut himself free of Claire that night. The truth was the opposite. That night, for the first time, he had put himself completely in her hands. Because the clause his lawyers were so proud of, the ironclad clause, the one that said each party's assets remain solely their own, would soon mean something Ethan had never imagined. It would mean that when the reckoning came, when Northbridge called its loans and the contracts collapsed and the board turned on him, he would have no claim, none at all, on the one person whose signature could have saved him. He'd walled her off. Perfectly. Permanently. He'd walled himself off from the only lifeboat in the ocean. Marcus turned the car toward the highway, and Claire watched the lights of Manhattan grow smaller behind her, and she thought not with triumph, but with a strange and heavy sadness about the young man on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment who had cried in her arms and sworn he'd never forget. "I hope you find him again," she'd told Ethan in the restaurant. "You'll need him." She'd meant it. That was the part he'd never understand. Even now, after everything, part of Claire still hoped that somewhere underneath the arrogance and the champagne and the cruelty, the good man she'd married was still alive. Because that man, the real Ethan, the one who'd held her face in his hands and called her the only thing that mattered, that man deserved a chance to see what he'd thrown away and to become someone worthy of getting it back. But hope was one thing, and what was coming was another. What was coming had already been set in motion, in a vault, in a phone call, in the quiet turning of an empire's vast machinery. It could not be stopped now. Not by apology, not by regret, not by all the champagne in Manhattan. Ethan Walker had signed the divorce papers, certain he'd won. He was about to spend the next year of his life discovering exactly how completely, how catastrophically, how permanently he had lost. And it would begin, as these things always do, with a man he trusted, a look he'd never seen before, and 3 small words spoken in a cold conference room on an ordinary Monday morning. He raised his glass one more time that night and drank to a victory that was already quietly turning to ash in his hands. He just didn't know it yet, but he would. The Monday morning that ended, Ethan Walker's world began like every other Monday morning of his new life, which is to say it began with him, certain he was the most important man in any room he walked into. He arrived at Walker Innovations headquarters at 7:15 earlier than usual because there was a call scheduled for 9 with Northbridge Capital, and Ethan liked to be sharp for the Northbridge calls. Northbridge had been with him from the beginning. They'd never once questioned him, never once pushed back, never once made him feel like the frightened kid who'd been laughed out of 17 conference rooms. He thought of Halloran almost as a friend, though he'd only met the man in person a handful of times. There was something reassuring about Northbridge. They believed in him the way no one else ever had. Ethan did not know why. He had never asked why. And that once again was the flaw that was about to destroy him. "Morning, Mr. Walker," his assistant said, handing him a coffee. "Morning. Is the conference room set up for the Northbridge call?" "Yes, sir. And Mr. Reyes wanted to see you before the call. He said it was urgent." Ethan frowned. Marcus Reyes was his chief financial officer, a careful, unflappable man who did not use the word urgent lightly. In 3 years, Ethan could count on one hand the number of times Reyes had wanted to see him urgently. About what? He didn't say. He just said, "the moment you got in." Ethan felt the first small, cold touch of something he couldn't name. He shook it off. He was Ethan Walker. He'd just landed himself a spot on another magazine's list of visionaries under 40. Whatever Reyes wanted, it could be handled. Everything could be handled. That was what money bought you, the certainty that everything could be handled. He walked into his office, set down his coffee, and Reyes was already there, standing by the window, and the moment Ethan saw the man's face, the cold touch turned into a cold hand around his spine. Reyes did not look unflappable. Reyes looked like a man who had not slept. "Marcus, what's wrong?" "Close the door." Ethan closed the door. "You're scaring me. What is it?" Reyes had a folder in his hands and his knuckles were white around it. "I got an email at 11 o'clock last night, from Northbridge, from their legal department, not from Halloran." He paused, and Ethan watched the man visibly search for words, which he'd never seen Reyes do before. "Ethan, I've read it about 40 times, and I keep hoping I'm misreading it. I'm not misreading it. Just tell me." "Northbridge is pulling out." For a second, the words didn't land. They arrived at Ethan's ears, but they refused to reach the part of his brain that understood language. "Pulling out of what?" "Everything." Reyes opened the folder and set a printed page on the desk. "The next funding round. It's canceled. But that's not the problem. That's not even close to the problem." He set down a second page. "They're calling the loans, all of them. Effective immediately." Ethan laughed. It came out of him before he could stop it, a short, disbelieving bark. "That's insane. That's not how it works. You can't just call 3 years of loans on a Monday morning. There are terms. There are schedules. There are covenants," Reyes said quietly, "and apparently we're in breach of one of them. There's a clause, Ethan. Section 14, subsection C. I've never had a reason to look at it closely because Northbridge never gave us a reason. It gives them the right to accelerate full repayment at their sole discretion if there's a material change in the ownership or governance structure of any party to the agreement." Reyes looked up. Did anything change? In the last week, anything at all? And Ethan Walker's stomach dropped through the floor. Because something had changed. Something had changed 6 days ago, at a table in a restaurant called Lumiere, when a woman in a navy dress had signed her name and walked out of his life. He didn't understand how that could possibly matter to Northbridge. He couldn't see the connection. But some animal part of him, the part that had survived 17 rejections, the part that knew when a room had turned against him, that part of him made the connection before his conscious mind could, and it whispered a single impossible word: Claire. "No," Ethan said out loud to Reyes, to himself, to the whisper. Nothing changed. Nothing that would matter to them. He picked up the first page and scanned it, and the language was cold and legal and absolutely real, and at the bottom was a number. The number was every dollar Northbridge had ever put into Walker Innovations, plus interest, due in full within 30 days. This is a mistake. This has to be a mistake. Get Halloran on the phone, right now. I've been trying since midnight. He's not answering. His office says he's, quote, no longer handling the Walker account. No longer handling... Ethan set the page down with a hand that had started very slightly to shake. What does that mean Halloran's been my guy for 3 years? I don't know what it means, but Ethan, listen to me because you need to hear the whole thing before the 9 o'clock call. Reyes took a breath. I pulled our full debt structure last night, all of it, everything we owe to everyone, and I need you to sit down for this part. I don't want to sit down. Sit down. Ethan sat down. Northbridge doesn't just hold some of our debt, Reyes said. I always thought they were one investor among several. That's how it looked on the surface. Different fund names, different entities spread across the whole capital structure. But last night I traced the ownership all the way up, and Ethan, they're all the same. Blackfern Holdings, Meridian Trust, Coastal Equity Partners. Every one of them rolls up to the same parent. It's all Northbridge. And Northbridge holds 85% of the total debt of this company. He let that sit. 85%, one investor. And that one investor just called it all in. My Awasaki Tamai Taitas. Ethan stared at him. That's not possible. Our capital structure was diversified. My lawyers, the bankers, they set it up so we'd never be exposed to a single... They set up what they were shown. What they were shown was designed to look diversified. It never was. From the very beginning, from the very first check, this whole company has been financed by one entity wearing a dozen different masks. Reyes's voice dropped. Somebody built it this way on purpose, Ethan. From the start. Somebody wanted to be able to do exactly this, exactly whenever they chose. And now Ethan could not breathe, because the whisper was back louder, and it was no longer a whisper from the very first check. 5 years ago. A firm he'd never heard of. A soft-spoken man named Halloran who listened to his whole pitch and slid a term sheet across the table with a number that made his vision blur when 17 other investors had laughed. He'd never asked why. He'd run all the way home 4 flights of stairs and burst into the apartment shouting, and Claire had been at the stove, and she'd said, "You did it, my love. It was always going to be you. You did it." Ethan gripped the edge of the desk. "Ethan?" Reyes was watching him. "You've gone white. What is it? What are you thinking?" "Nothing." He forced the word out. "I'm thinking nothing. Get the legal team in. We fight this. There has to be a way to fight this." But even as he said it, even as he reached for the certainty that everything could be handled, Ethan Walker felt the ground he'd been standing on for 5 years begin silently to disappear beneath his feet. The 9 o'clock call did not go the way Ethan hoped. There was no Halloran. Instead, there was a woman named Ms. Ainsley from Northbridge's legal division, cool and precise, who confirmed everything Reyes had found and offered exactly nothing. The loans were being called. The covenant had been triggered. Northbridge was well within its rights. Repayment was due in 30 days, and after that, the company's assets would be subject to seizure. "This is a relationship built over 5 years," Ethan said, and he hated how his voice sounded, hated the pleading edge that had crept into it. "Halloran and I, we go back to the beginning. There's history here. You can't just—" "Mr. Walker," Ms. Ainsley said, "I understand this is difficult, but Northbridge is acting on explicit instructions. The decision has been made at a level well above the Walker account. I'm not able to reverse it, and neither is anyone you could reach today." "Above the account. What does that mean, above the account? Who gives Northbridge instructions?" There was a pause on the line, a small, deliberate pause, and then Ms. Ainsley said very carefully, "That's not something I'm able to discuss, Mr. Walker. I'd suggest you focus your energy on securing alternative financing. You have 30 days. The call ended. Ethan sat in the conference room surrounded by his legal team and his executives, and for a long moment nobody spoke because there was nothing to say. 30 days to replace 85% of the company's debt. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. You couldn't raise that kind of money in 30 days. Not for a company that had just had its primary investor publicly brutally walk away. The moment word got out that Northbridge had called its loans and word would get out, it always got out, every other lender in the city would smell blood. "We start calling everyone," Ethan said. "Today, every investor, every bank, every fund, somebody will step in. This is still a good company. The product works. The revenue's real. Somebody will see that." They started calling. And for the first 2 days, Ethan let himself believe it might work. He was Ethan Walker after all. He'd built this from nothing, from a closet, from a laptop. The magazines called him a genius. Surely a genius could raise money in a crisis. Then the first no came in, then the second, then the third. They were polite. They were always polite. "Interesting company, Mr. Walker. We'll be in touch." And the phrase hit Ethan like a fist every single time because it was the exact phrase, word for word, that 17 investors had used 5 years ago in the days before Northbridge appeared like a miracle and saved him. Interesting. We'll be in touch. They were never in touch. It was Wednesday afternoon after the 9th no of the day that Ethan finally said out loud the thing he'd been refusing to think. He was alone in his office. Reyes had gone home. The building was quiet, and Ethan sat at his desk with his head in his hands, and he thought about the pause on the phone with Ms. Ainsley, and the phrase above the account, and the 12 masks that all rolled up to one face, and the miracle 5 years ago that he'd never once questioned, and a woman at a stove saying, "You did it, my love." And finally, Ethan Walker asked himself the question he had never in his life asked. Why? Why had Northbridge said yes when 17 others said no? What had they seen in a broke programmer that no one else could see? He'd always assumed it was his brilliance, his vision, the obvious, undeniable quality of the thing he'd built. But that was arrogance, wasn't it? That was 5 years of magazine covers talking. The truth was, back then, there'd been nothing obvious about him at all. He'd been a nobody with a folder full of rejections. 17 professional investors, whose entire job was to spot potential, had looked at him and seen nothing. And then one firm out of nowhere had seen everything. Why Ethan picked up his phone. He pulled up an old email, the very first email he'd ever gotten from Northbridge 5 years and a lifetime ago. He read it again. It was warm, encouraging. It said Northbridge had been made aware of his company through a mutual connection and was very interested in learning more. A mutual connection. He'd never thought about that phrase before. Not once. Who was the mutual connection? He'd been so desperate, so grateful, that he'd never stopped to wonder who had connected a small, secretive investment firm to a company that had no profile, no press, no reason at all to be on anybody's radar. Who knew about Walker Innovations 5 years ago? When nobody knew about Walker Innovations, Ethan's hand went cold around the phone. 3 people had known. Him, his 2 employees, and Claire. "No," he said again to the empty office. "No, that's insane. She sold her mother's ring. She heated soup on a hot plate. She's from Ohio. Her dad's a mechanic. She couldn't have." But the animal part of him, the part that survived, was screaming now, and Ethan Walker stood up so fast his chair fell over, and he grabbed his coat because there was one person who could tell him he was crazy. One person who could look him in the eye and laugh and say, "Ethan, listen to yourself, and put this insane idea back in the box where it belonged." He had to see Claire. The house outside Boston was dark when he got there hours later, having caught the last flight and driven from the airport with his heart hammering the whole way. It was the small house they'd bought in the early years, the one he'd given her in the divorce, and he'd expected to find her there in the modest little life he'd generously left her. She wasn't there. The house was empty. Not messy empty the way a house is when someone's just stepped out. Empty. The furniture was covered. The refrigerator was unplugged and propped open. There was a thin layer of dust on the kitchen counter where he'd once watched her heat soup and tell him he'd done it. Nobody had lived here in weeks. Ethan stood in the dark kitchen of the house he'd thought was Claire's whole world, and the first real fear of his life crawled up his throat. Where was she? He found a neighbor, an older woman 2 houses down, who peered at him through a chained door. "I'm looking for Claire," he said. "Claire Bennett. She lives at number 12. Lived. She was here." "You mean the quiet young woman?" The neighbor's face softened, then sharpened. "You're the husband, aren't you? The one on the magazines." "Yes, please. Do you know where she went?" "A car came for her about 2 weeks ago. Big black car, the kind with a driver." The woman studied him with something that might have been pity. "She hugged me goodbye, gave me her houseplants, said she was going home to her family." She started to close the door, then paused. "Funny thing, always figured she came from nothing, that girl. Simple. Kind. But the man driving that car, he called her something when he opened the door for her. Wasn't Bennett." Ethan's mouth had gone dry. "What did he call her?" "Sinclair," the woman said. "He called her Miss Sinclair." And the door closed, and Ethan Walker stood alone on a dark street in a town he'd flown across the country to reach, and the name hit him like the floor rushing up to meet a falling man. Sinclair. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name, the way you know the name of a mountain range or an ocean, as a fact of the landscape too large to really see. Sinclair. Sinclair International Holdings. Banks, shipping, real estate on 6 continents. Old money. The oldest, the kind that didn't chase headlines because it owned the paper the headlines were printed on. He'd stood in rooms full of billionaires who lowered their voices when the Sinclair name came up. It was a coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. Sinclair was a common enough name. There were probably 1,000 Sinclairs. The driver had probably said something else, and the old woman had misheard. But even as Ethan built the wall of denial brick by desperate brick, the whisper that had become a scream became now something worse. It became quiet. It became certain. And in that terrible quiet, Ethan Walker began at last to understand. The miracle 5 years ago. The one investor who saw what 17 couldn't. The mutual connection nobody could name. Northbridge financing his whole company through a dozen masks, from the very first check patient, and generous for 5 years, never once pushing back. And then 6 days after Claire signed the divorce papers, and a black car came to take her home, Northbridge called every loan on a Monday morning on instructions from a level above the account. Above the account. Ethan had walled his company off from his wife. Ironclad, his lawyers had said. Each party's assets remained solely their own. He'd been so proud of that clause, so certain it protected his fortune. He understood now what it protected. He got back in the car and drove. He didn't know where, just drove, and somewhere on a dark highway between Boston and the airport, Ethan Walker started to laugh, and then the laugh broke apart into something that wasn't a laugh at all, and he had to pull over onto the shoulder because he couldn't see the road anymore. She'd saved him. From the very beginning. The woman he'd called an embarrassment. The woman he'd called training wheels in front of two laughing strangers. She'd heard about his dream, and she'd reached into a fortune older than the railroads, and she'd built the invisible ground he'd spent 5 years running on, and she'd never told him not once because she wanted him to feel like he'd done it himself. You did it, my love. It was always going to be you. He'd sold her mother's ring to keep the lights on, and she'd let him because if she'd stopped him, he might have wondered how the woman from Ohio had the money to save it. Every sacrifice, every night on the floor, every gentle lie, all of it so that Ethan Walker could stand on a stage he didn't build and believe he'd earned it. And he'd thanked her by handing her divorce papers over an $18 bottle of water and telling her she didn't belong in his world. His world. God. His world was hers. It had always been hers. She'd loaned it to him, and he'd been so busy admiring himself in the mirror that he'd looked at the person holding the whole thing up and called her a burden. Ethan sat on the shoulder of the highway with his hands shaking on the wheel, and for the first time in 5 years longer, he thought about the man on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment, the frightened young man who'd cried in Claire's arms and sworn he'd never forget who was there when it didn't work. "I hope you find him again," she'd said in the restaurant. "You'll need him." She'd known, even then, even signing the papers, she'd known exactly what was coming, and she'd tried to tell him gently the way she'd always been gentle, and he'd been too busy feeling victorious to hear it. He had to find her. He had to see her. He had to explain, apologize, beg something, anything. He drove to the airport and bought a ticket back to the city and spent the whole flight rehearsing what he'd say, and by the time he landed, he'd convinced himself that if he could just get to her, just look her in the eye, just remind her of Fillmore Street, she'd understand. She'd loved him once. That kind of love didn't just disappear. He'd apologize and she'd forgive him, and she'd call off Northbridge, and everything would go back to the way it was. That was the thing about Ethan Walker even now, even falling. He still thought this was about him. He still thought his apology could undo it. He still didn't understand that some things once broken cannot be signed back into existence, no matter how sorry the man holding the pen. But Claire was not a person he could simply reach. He learned that over the next 3 days. He called every number he had. Disconnected. He emailed. No response. He went to Walker Innovations and had his assistant try to find any contact for Sinclair International Holdings. And the answers came back the way answers always come back when you've fallen out of a world you were only ever visiting. No listed number, no public office, a wall of assistants and gatekeepers and polite, impenetrable nothing. The Sinclairs did not take calls from Ethan Walker. The Sinclairs had never heard of Ethan Walker, and that, more than the loans, more than the collapse, was the thing that finally made him understand how small he had always been. He'd thought he was a mountain. He was a pebble that a mountain had, for reasons of love, once decided to carry. Meanwhile, the company was dying. Word had gotten out exactly as everyone feared. Northbridge pulls out of Walker Innovations. The tech press which had built Ethan up took to tearing him down with the same enthusiasm. Every investor call ended the same way. The board began holding meetings Ethan wasn't invited to. Victoria stopped coming by his office. He noticed that. He noticed everything now with the raw, new awareness of a man who'd had the ground pulled out from under him. And he noticed that Victoria Hayes, who'd toasted to new beginnings, had grown very hard to find. "We need to talk about the board," Reyes told him on the 12th day. "Ethan, there's a movement. Some of the directors, they're saying the company's only chance is new leadership, a clean face for new investors, somebody without the Northbridge stink on them." "New leadership? You mean fire me?" "I mean they're talking about it. I wanted you to hear it from me." Ethan laughed that broken laugh he'd found on the highway. "Fire me from the company I built. That's rich. That's just—" He stopped. Because he hadn't built it, had he? Not really. Not the way he'd always believed. He'd built the product. But the company, the actual living thing, had been built on her money, and now that her money had walked out the door, the whole structure was folding like a tent in a storm. "Who's leading it?" he asked. "The movement. Which director?" Reyes hesitated. "Marcus." "Who?" "It's not a director," Reyes said quietly. "It's Victoria." The name landed, and Ethan closed his eyes. She went to the board 3 days ago. Reyes went on, and he sounded almost gentle about it, the way you're gentle telling a man his dog has died. She made a case that the company needs to distance itself from you completely, that your name is now toxic to investors. She's positioning herself, interim CEO. She's got 2 directors already, and she's working the rest. Ethan sat very still. Victoria Hayes, the woman he'd left his wife for, the woman who'd looked at him not the way Claire looked at him, but the way a climber looks at a mountain. And now that the mountain was crumbling, she was scrambling for a new one, and it turned out the new one was the wreckage of the old. "She's using this," he said. "She's using the collapse to take the company." "Yes. The company that's collapsing because I threw away the person who was holding it up, so that I could be with her." Ethan started to laugh again, and this time there was something almost peaceful in it, the terrible peace of a man watching every single thing he'd chosen turn against him at once. "That's Marcus that's almost funny. Isn't that almost funny?" "It's not funny, Ethan." No, it isn't." He opened his eyes. "How long do I have?" "Board meeting's Friday. If she gets the votes and she's close, they'll remove you. There's not much I can do. I'm sorry. I've been with you since the 2nd year, and I mean it. I'm sorry." Ethan looked at his CFO, one of the only people in the building who hadn't already started measuring him for a coffin, and he felt a wave of gratitude so sharp it hurt, and right behind it, a wave of shame, because he realized he'd never once in 3 years thanked this man for anything. He'd taken Reyes for granted, the way he'd taken everyone for granted, the way he'd taken Claire for granted. And now at the very end, with everything falling apart, Reyes was still standing in his office trying to soften the blow. "Thank you, Marcus," Ethan said, and his voice cracked on it. "I don't think I've ever said that to you. In 3 years, I'm saying it now. Thank you." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, surprised, and something in his face shifted some small reappraisal. "You're welcome," he said. Then quieter. "For what it's worth, this version of you, the one saying thank you, I like him a lot better than the one who's been running this place the last 2 years." And Ethan Walker, billionaire, founder, magazine genius, the man who'd been so certain 6 days into a divorce that he'd won, put his face in his hands and understood that the truest thing anyone had said to him in years had just come from the man delivering the news of his professional death. That night, alone in the enormous house he'd bought to impress people who no longer returned his calls, Ethan did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He went into the back of his closet and found a shoebox he'd carried from apartment to apartment, from the closet office to the Empire, and never opened. Inside were the artifacts of the man he used to be. A cracked phone from the Fillmore Street days, a rejection letter from the 9th of the 17 investors, which he'd kept out of spite, and a photograph curled at the edges of a young man and a young woman sitting on a mattress on the floor, laughing at something outside the frame, so broke and so happy that looking at it now felt like looking at strangers. He looked at Claire's face in the photograph, young and open and full of a love so plain and so total that he couldn't understand how he'd ever stop seeing it. She hadn't changed. That was the thing that broke him, sitting on the floor of his mansion with a shoebox in his lap. She'd looked at him with that exact same love on the night he handed her the divorce papers. He'd seen it and called it resignation. He'd seen it and mistaken it for weakness. It had been there the whole time, the whole 10 years steady and quiet, and asking for nothing, and he'd looked right at it and decided it wasn't good enough for the man he'd become. Real power never needs to announce itself. She might have told him if he'd ever bothered to listen. It simply exists. He'd been surrounded by the most powerful woman in any room he'd ever stood in, and he'd spent 5 years trying to trade her in for a woman who sparkled. Ethan put the photograph down and made a decision. It was the first genuinely selfless decision he'd made in years, and it came too late to save anything, which is how those decisions usually come. He was going to find her, not to beg her to save the company, not to ask her to call off Northbridge. He'd stopped fooling himself about that somewhere over the last 3 days. The company was gone. He could feel it. Victoria would take what was left, and Northbridge would take the rest, and there would be nothing in 30 days with Ethan Walker's name on it. He was going to find Claire for one reason only: to tell her he was sorry, to tell her he finally understood what she'd done for him and what he'd done to her, and that she'd been right about everything, and that the man on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment was ashamed of the man he'd become. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. He just needed her to hear it once from his own mouth. But he couldn't reach her. Every door was closed. The Sinclair wall was absolute. And then on the 14th day, an invitation arrived, not to him personally, to Walker Innovations, addressed to the office of the CEO, a role he still technically held for 3 more days. It was thick cream cardstock engraved, the kind of invitation that cost more than most people's monthly rent. And it invited the CEO of Walker Innovations to a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in support of a foundation for children's education, hosted by a coalition of the country's leading philanthropic families. Ethan almost threw it away. His last charity gala had been the night he'd called Claire training wheels. He never wanted to attend one again. But something made him look at the list of hosting families printed in elegant type across the bottom of the card, and there, third from the left, between 2 names he didn't recognize, was the one name that stopped his heart: the Sinclair Family Foundation. He read it 3 times. Then he understood with a strange cold calm what he was holding. This was not a coincidence. Northbridge had his company on their books. Northbridge answered to the Sinclairs. And the CEO of Walker Innovations had just received an invitation to a gala hosted by the Sinclair family. Somebody had put his name on that list. Somebody wanted him there. She wanted him there. Claire. It had to be Claire. She was going to be at that gala, and she'd made sure the invitation reached him, and Ethan didn't know if it was an act of mercy or an act of judgment, whether she wanted to give him a chance to speak or simply wanted him in the room to witness with his own eyes exactly who she was. Either way, it was the only door in the entire Sinclair wall that had opened even a crack. And Ethan Walker, who had spent 6 days certain he'd won and 8 days learning how completely he'd lost, knew he was going to walk through it no matter what waited on the other side. He set the invitation on the mantel next to the shoebox photograph of 2 broke kids laughing on a mattress, and he looked at the 2 of them together. The reminder of who he'd been and the summons to face who she'd become. And for the first time since the Monday morning that ended his world, Ethan Walker was not thinking about his company, or his fortune, or Victoria, or the board, He was thinking about a woman in a navy dress who'd looked at him across a white tablecloth and said, "You were a good man once. I hope you find him again. You'll need him." The gala was in 6 days. He had that long to find the good man, if the good man was still in there at all, because whatever happened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whatever Claire had planned, whether it was forgiveness or reckoning or something colder than both, Ethan Walker understood one thing with total clarity as he stood in his empty mansion holding the ruins of the life he'd chosen over the woman who'd built it. He was going to face her, and he had absolutely no idea, none at all, whether the woman he'd meet on that grand staircase would be the Claire who'd loved him on the floor of a freezing apartment, or the sole heir to a $1 trillion empire he had insulted, dismissed, and thrown away. He suspected deep down that she would be both, and that terrified him more than bankruptcy ever could. The 6 days before the gala were the longest of Ethan Walker's life, and the strangest because for the first time in years he had nothing to do but think, and thinking was the one thing he'd spent his whole rise avoiding. On the 16th day, the board voted. He wasn't in the room. That was the cruelest part, or maybe it was a mercy. They didn't even make him sit through it. Reyes called him at 4 in the afternoon, and Ethan knew before he answered because Reyes never called anymore. They only texted, and a call meant it was the kind of news you didn't put in writing. "It's done," Reyes said. "I'm sorry, Ethan. It was 7-2. Victoria's interim CEO effective immediately. They're changing the locks tonight. They want your badge and your keys by end of day. I fought it. For what it's worth, I fought it hard." Ethan stood in his kitchen holding the phone, and he waited to feel the thing he'd expected to feel: the rage, the devastation, the world ending. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and worse, a kind of numb recognition. Of course they'd taken it. He'd built a company on a stranger's love and called the love an embarrassment, and now the love was gone, and so was everything it had been holding up, and Victoria Hayes was sitting in his chair, and it was all so perfectly mathematically just that Ethan almost admired it. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, "for fighting and for calling. You didn't have to." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." That was the truth. He genuinely didn't know. "There's a thing on Friday. I have to go to a thing on Friday. After that, I don't know." A thing. A gala. It doesn't matter. "Marcus, listen. Whatever happens with Victoria, you're the best CFO in this city, and you were the only one who told me the truth this whole time. If you ever need a reference from a man whose name is currently worth exactly nothing, you know where to find me." There was a pause, and then Reyes laughed a short, surprised sound. 2 months ago, you'd have fired me for less than that phone call. 2 months ago, I was an idiot. "Yeah," Reyes said not unkindly. "You kind of were. Go to your gala, Ethan. Take care of yourself." The line went dead, and Ethan Walker set down the phone in the kitchen of a mansion that was already, though he didn't know it yet, being quietly assessed by the bank that would soon take it, and he understood that he had just had the last real conversation of his professional life. Everyone else was gone. The investors, the founders who used to laugh at his jokes, the executives who'd hung on his every word, gone the moment the money left. Only Reyes had stayed, and only long enough to say goodbye. He turned in his badge that evening. A security guard he'd never spoken to, a man whose name he'd never bothered to learn in 3 years, took it from him at the front desk with an expression of careful blankness. And Ethan realized as he handed it over that this man had watched him walk through these doors every morning for years, and Ethan had never once said good morning. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. The guard blinked, surprised. "Dennis, sir." "Dennis? I'm sorry I never asked before. 3 years. That's inexcusable." Ethan set the badge on the counter. "Take care of yourself, Dennis." And he walked out of Walker Innovations for the last time into a city that had stopped caring about him, and behind him, up on the top floor, in an office that used to be his, Victoria Hayes, was already redecorating. He heard about Victoria over the next few days in fragments from the tech press that had once fawned over him and now feasted on his corpse. New CEO. Victoria Hayes promises fresh start for troubled Walker Innovations. Hayes distances company from disgraced founder. There was a photo of her at his desk in his chair, smiling the sharp, bright smile he'd once mistaken for affection. She'd given an interview. In it, she called his leadership quote a cautionary tale and said the company had been, quote, held hostage by one man's ego for too long. Ethan read it in the mansion alone, and he waited again for the rage, and again it didn't come because every word she said was true. He had been an ego. He had held it hostage. The only thing Victoria got wrong was the implication that she was any different. She wasn't. She was exactly what he'd become just earlier in the arc, still climbing, not yet fallen. In a year or two, the same thing would happen to her, because a company built on ambition without love is a company waiting for the moment its people realize there's nothing underneath. But that was Victoria's lesson to learn. Ethan had his own. He barely slept the night before the gala. He kept the shoebox photograph on his nightstand, 2 broke kids laughing on a mattress, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Claire's face. Not the young laughing face in the photo, but the calm, clear face across the white tablecloth at Lumiere. "You didn't leave because I wasn't enough." He'd played that moment back 1,000 times now. He'd been so busy feeling generous, so busy performing his own decency, that he'd missed what was right in front of him. She hadn't been resigned that night. She'd been finished. There was a difference, and it had taken him losing everything to learn it. He rented a tuxedo because his own had been repossessed with the rest, along with the cars and the art and most of the furniture. The rental was slightly too big in the shoulders. Ethan looked at himself in the mirror of the emptying mansion, a man in a borrowed tuxedo in a house that no longer belonged to him, on his way to face the woman whose empire he'd insulted, and he thought, "This is the most honest I've looked in 5 years." The gala was at 8. Ethan arrived at 7:45 and his hands were shaking. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had been transformed for the evening, but Ethan barely registered any of it. The grandeur, the music, the extraordinary wealth moving through the great hall in gowns and tailored black. He'd stood in rooms like this 100 times back when he thought he belonged in them. He understood now that he'd never belonged. He'd been a guest on a pass that Claire had quietly paid for, in a world that was hers by blood and his only by borrowed light. He moved through the crowd looking for her, and everywhere he looked, he saw the machinery of the world he'd thought he'd conquered. Senators, titans of industry, a former Secretary of State laughing at something, faces from the covers of the magazines that had once put his own face beside the word genius. And not one of them knew who Ethan Walker was. Or worse, some of them did, and their eyes slid over him the way you look at a man you've read is dying, with a flicker of recognition, and then a fast, embarrassed turning away. He got a glass of champagne he didn't drink just to have something to hold, and he waited. At 8:15, a man he vaguely recognized approached him. It took Ethan a moment to place him, and then he did. Gerald Ashford, an old money financier, one of the men who'd lowered his voice whenever the Sinclair name came up. Ashford had been at some of the parties in Ethan's rising days. They'd shaken hands once or twice. Ashford had been polite in the way powerful men are polite to people they don't expect to see again. "Walker," Ashford said, and there was something in his tone Ethan couldn't read. "Didn't expect to see you here. After everything. I was invited. So I gathered. Interesting." Ashford took a sip of his drink and studied Ethan over the rim of the glass with open, almost clinical curiosity. "You know I have to ask, and forgive me because it's not a kind question, but everyone's been wondering, did you really not know?" Ethan's stomach tightened. "Know what?" "Who she was." Ashford's eyebrows rose. "Your wife. 10 years married, and the story going around is that you had no idea. I told people that couldn't possibly be true. A man doesn't marry a Sinclair and not know it. But the way you're standing there, the way you just went pale, I'm starting to think the story's true." He shook his head slowly, almost with wonder. "My God, man, you really didn't know." "You know her," Ethan managed. "Everyone in this room knows her, or knows of her. Claire Whitmore Sinclair, old Richard's only child, the heir." Ashford said the word the way you'd say the name of a queen. "She dropped off the map, 7-8 years ago. Whole family said she wanted privacy. There were rumors she'd run off, changed her name, was living some ordinary little life somewhere just to see what it felt like." He looked at Ethan with dawning comprehension. "That was you, wasn't it? The ordinary little life. You were the experiment." Ethan couldn't speak. The word experiment landed somewhere deep and did terrible damage. Was that what he'd been? An experiment. A rich woman slumming it to feel real. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was wrong. Because he'd lived those years he'd been on that floor with her, he'd felt the realness of her love in a way no experiment could fake. She hadn't been playing at loving him. She'd sold her mother's ring or let him think she had. She'd stayed when he was nothing. That wasn't an experiment. That was the realest thing that had ever happened to him, and he'd thrown it in a museum coat check and called it training wheels. "She wasn't experimenting," Ethan said, and his voice came out rough. "She loved me." Ashford's expression flickered something almost like respect. "Then you're an even bigger fool than the story makes you out to be. Because if a Sinclair loved you, actually loved you, and you let her go—" He shook his head. "There's no fortune in the world worth what you threw away, son. And you had the fortune and the love, and you kept neither." He set down his glass. "The lights are about to dim. They're going to introduce the family. I'd find a wall to stand against if I were you. You're going to want something to hold on to." And Ashford melted back into the crowd, leaving Ethan Walker standing alone in the middle of the great hall with an untouched glass of champagne and a heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The lights began to dim. A hush moved through the room, the particular hush of very powerful people falling silent for someone even more powerful. The music faded. The crowd turned, all of them, toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall, and Ethan turned with them because he couldn't not, because every instinct in his body was screaming at him now. A voice smooth and amplified filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is our profound honor tonight to welcome the patrons of the Sinclair Family Foundation, whose generosity has made this evening and the futures of 10,000 children possible. Please welcome the chairman of Sinclair International Holdings, Mr. Richard Sinclair, and his daughter, Miss Claire Sinclair." The room erupted in applause, and Ethan Walker looked up at the staircase and felt the entire world stop. The man came first, Richard Sinclair, silver-haired, straight-backed, with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be performed because it had never once been questioned. This was the man Ethan had been told was a retired mechanic in Ohio. This was the man whose photograph Claire had kept in a safe deposit box, a young girl on his shoulders in front of a shipping container. Ethan had shaken hands with 100 powerful men, and not one of them carried themselves the way Richard Sinclair carried himself, like a man who had never in his life had to wonder whether he mattered. And then, on his arm came Claire. For a moment, Ethan's mind refused to accept it, the way it had refused the loan documents, the way it had refused the neighbor's word, Sinclair. Because the woman descending the staircase was Claire unmistakably. Claire, the face he'd woken up next to for 10 years. And at the same time, she was a stranger, a woman he'd never met, a woman he could not possibly have been married to. Gone was the navy dress worn 6 years. Gone was the tied-back hair, the modest jewelry, the quality of quiet invisibility she'd worn like a second skin every single day of their marriage. The woman on the staircase wore a black gown that seemed to have been made from the night itself, and she wore it the way a queen wears a crown, without effort, without thought, as though she'd never worn anything else. Her hair was down, her posture was straight, and her face, her calm, clear, extraordinary face, was lifted toward a room full of the most powerful people in America, all of whom were on their feet, all of whom were applauding her. She wasn't invisible. That was the thing that broke something final in Ethan Walker. For 10 years, he'd watched Claire disappear into corners, stand silent at parties, give people nothing to ask about, and he'd thought that was who she was. Small, quiet, forgettable. He'd thought her quietness was emptiness. He understood now, standing in the dimmed hall, with his heart in pieces, that her quietness had never been emptiness. It had been restraint. She'd been holding all of this in for him the whole time. She'd folded herself down small enough to fit inside the life of a man who needed to feel big, and he'd looked at the folded version and decided she wasn't enough. Real power never needs to announce itself. She might have told him. It simply exists. He was watching it exist. He was watching the truest, largest version of the woman he'd thrown away descend a staircase to the applause of kings, and he had done everything in his power for 5 years to make her feel like she wasn't good enough for him. "That's my wife," Ethan whispered. He didn't mean to say it out loud. It just came out a small, broken sound lost in the applause. A woman standing near him, elegant gray-haired, glanced over with polite confusion. "I'm sorry." That's my wife, Claire. We were married." The woman's face changed as she looked at him, taking in the borrowed tuxedo, the pale face, the champagne he hadn't touched, and something like recognition dawned, and with it something like pity. "No, dear," she said gently, not cruelly, which somehow made it worse. "That's Claire Sinclair, the sole heir to the Sinclair empire. I don't think she's ever been married." And there it was, the final erasure. He hadn't just lost Claire. He'd been written out of her story entirely. In the world she'd returned to, the world she'd always belonged to, Ethan Walker didn't even exist. The 10 years, the apartment, the mattress on the floor, the man crying in her arms, none of it had happened because in this room, in this life, Claire Sinclair had never married a struggling programmer from nowhere. She'd simply gone away for a while, and now she'd come home. Ethan stood frozen while the applause washed over the hall. Claire and her father reached the bottom of the staircase and moved into the crowd, and Ethan watched from 30 feet away as the most powerful people in America came to her. Not to her father, to her. He watched a former Secretary of State take her hand. He watched a tech titan whose products were in 1 billion pockets lean in to hear something she said and laugh with genuine delight. He watched a woman he was fairly sure ran a small European country embrace Claire like an old friend. This was Claire's world. This had always been Claire's world, and she moved through it with a grace and an ease that made everything Ethan had ever achieved look like a child's drawing taped to a refrigerator. He should have left. Any sane man would have left. He'd seen what he came to see. He understood now with total and permanent clarity exactly who Claire was and exactly what he'd done, and there was nothing to be gained by staying. No apology that could matter. No words that could reach across the chasm between the man in the borrowed tuxedo and the woman being greeted by heads of state. But he couldn't leave, because somewhere underneath the shame, underneath the ruin, the frightened young man from Fillmore Street was awake now, fully awake, and that young man needed to do one thing before he disappeared forever. He needed to tell Claire he was sorry, not to fix anything, not to win anything, just to say it, just so that it had been said. So he moved through the crowd toward her. It was the hardest walk of his life. Every step took him deeper into a world that wasn't his, past people who were now, some of them, beginning to recognize him and to murmur the fallen founder, the Walker Innovations man. What's he doing here? He kept walking. He reached the edge of the circle of powerful people surrounding Claire, and he stopped and he waited, and eventually, inevitably, she saw him. Claire's eyes found his across the small space, and Ethan braced himself for anything. Fury, contempt, the satisfaction of a woman watching a man understand at last exactly what he'd done. He would have deserved any of it. But her face showed none of it. Her face showed nothing at all, or rather it showed the same thing it had shown across the white tablecloth at Lumiere, that calm, clear, terrible steadiness, the look of a person who had made her peace with something a long time ago and was now simply watching the other person catch up. "Ethan," she said. Just his name. Quietly. The circle of powerful people around her fell silent and turned to look at him, and Ethan felt every eye in that part of the room land on him at once. "Claire." His voice was barely working. Can we talk? Just for a minute. Please. There are things I need to say." She studied him for a long moment, and then, to the astonishment of the people around her, some of whom clearly knew exactly who Ethan was, and could not understand why the sole heir to the Sinclair fortune would give this ruined man 30 seconds of her time, Claire nodded. "All right," she said. 1 minute." She stepped away from the circle, and Ethan followed her to a quieter corner of the great hall, and for the first time since she'd walked out of Lumiere in a navy dress, they stood face to face, the struggling programmer she'd saved, and the heiress she'd become, and there was so much Ethan needed to say that for a moment he couldn't say anything at all. "I know," he finally managed. "I know everything now. Northbridge, it was you. From the beginning, the whole time. You saved the company. You saved me. You found me when I was nothing, and you built the ground I stood on, and you never told me because you wanted me to feel like I did it myself." The words were coming faster now, tumbling out 5 years of blindness, dissolving all at once. "And God, Claire, I thanked you by I called you. I said things in front of people. I said you were—" "Training wheels," Claire said. Ethan stopped. His face went white. "You heard that." "I was standing at the bar, at the Children's Hospital Gala. You were talking to Foster and Kim." Her voice was even, unhurried. "You said I was a good woman, but I was like the training wheels. That you needed me at the start, but at some point you take them off, or you never learn to ride." She tilted her head slightly. "It's a good metaphor, actually. It's just backwards. You didn't take the training wheels off, Ethan. You threw away the bike." He flinched. "Claire." "You want to apologize," she said. "I can see it. You've got a whole speech. You've been rehearsing it for days, so let me save you some time." She looked at him, and for just a moment, just one something moved behind the calm, some old grief quickly mastered. "You don't have to apologize for Northbridge or the company or any of it. The company was always going to survive or fall on its own once I stopped holding it up, and I stopped holding it up because you told me to my face that you needed a wife who could stand beside world leaders." She let that sit. "So I came to stand beside world leaders. You got exactly what you asked for, Ethan. You just didn't understand that I was the one who could do it, not the one who couldn't. The truth of it landed on him like a physical weight, and Ethan's eyes filled, and he didn't try to hide it. "I understand now. I know you do." And there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, which was worse than anger, because anger meant she still felt something hot, and gentleness meant she'd moved all the way past it. "That's the sad part, isn't it? You understand now. You couldn't understand it when it would have mattered. You could only understand it after you'd lost everything. That's not wisdom, Ethan. That's just the bill coming due." "Claire, I don't want the company back. I don't want the money. I know I have no right to any of it. I came here for one reason. Just one." His voice broke completely now. "I came to tell you that the man you married, the one on the floor of the apartment on Fillmore Street, that man is ashamed of what I became. That man is standing here right now, and he's sorry. Not for the money. For you. For every day I looked at the best person I've ever known and decided she wasn't good enough. I'm sorry. Claire, I'm so sorry, and I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it's 10 years too late, but I couldn't disappear without you hearing it." For a long moment, Claire said nothing. The music played somewhere behind them. The most powerful people in America laughed and drank and made deals 30 feet away, none of them aware that in this quiet corner, the whole story of a marriage was reaching its end. And then Claire did something Ethan didn't expect. She reached out and she touched his face just for a second, the way she'd touched it 1,000 times on a mattress on the floor, and her eyes softened, and for one heartbeat, he saw her, the real her, the woman who'd loved him before the world knew his name. "I know you're sorry," she said quietly. "And the strange thing is, I believe you. I think the man I married really is standing here. I think he came back. Too late, but he came back." She let her hand fall. "But here's what you have to understand, Ethan. Me forgiving you and me taking you back are two completely different things. I can forgive you. I think I already have. But I will never again build my life around a man who had to lose everything before he could see me. Because the next time he got comfortable, the next time the world called him a genius, he'd forget how to see me all over again. And I'm done being something a man has to lose in order to learn to appreciate." She stepped back. "I hope you find your way, Ethan. I mean that. There's a good man in you. I always knew there was. I just couldn't be the one who spent her whole life waiting for him to show up." And then she turned and she walked back toward the light, toward the circle of powerful people, toward the world that had always been hers. And Ethan Walker stood alone in the corner of the great hall and watched the only person who'd ever truly loved him rejoin a life he had no place in. He'd gotten his minute. He'd said his sorry. And she'd given him the one thing he hadn't dared hope for forgiveness, and withheld the one thing he'd secretly still been praying for a second chance. And somehow both of those things were exactly, perfectly right. And Ethan understood, as he watched her go, that this was the last time he would ever be this close to Claire Sinclair. He set down the champagne he'd never touched. He walked out of the Metropolitan Museum of Art past the Titans and the Senators and the fallen founder murmurs out into the cold Manhattan night, a man in a borrowed tuxedo with nothing left to lose because he'd already lost all of it. And behind him in the great lit hall, Claire Sinclair took her father's arm and smiled at a room full of the most powerful people in the world. And only Richard Sinclair, who knew his daughter better than anyone alive, saw the single tear she blinked away before it could fall and leaned close and murmured, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," Claire said softly, watching the door where Ethan had disappeared. "I just said goodbye to someone I loved a long time ago. The Walker boy." "The Walker boy." She turned back to the room, and her composure returned like a tide coming in. He finally understood. Everything. Right at the very end, Richard Sinclair followed her gaze to the door, and something in the old man's face was unreadable. "Do you regret it?" "Any of it." And Claire Whitmore, Sinclair's sole heir to a $1 trillion empire, the woman a room full of kings had risen to their feet to honor, looked at the closed door for one last moment before the crowd swept her back into the life she'd been born to. "No," she said, "I don't regret loving him. I only regret that he needed to lose the whole world to remember he'd already had everything that mattered." The fall, once it truly began, happened faster than anyone had imagined, and Ethan Walker had no choice but to feel every second of it. The mansion went first. He'd known it was coming, and still the morning the notice arrived, the reality of it hollowed him out. The bank had assessed the property against his personal debts, the loans he'd taken against the house, to fund a lifestyle he'd thought would last forever, and the math was simple and merciless. He had 30 days to vacate a house he'd bought to prove something to people who no longer remembered his name. He didn't fight it. That surprised him how little he wanted to fight anything anymore. He walked through the enormous empty rooms, most of the furniture already gone sold or seized, and he felt almost nothing except a strange, distant embarrassment at the man who'd bought all of it. Who had he been trying to impress? He couldn't even remember their names, faces at parties, founders who'd laughed at his jokes and vanished the instant the money did. He'd spent 5 years and a fortune buying the admiration of people who'd never actually cared whether he lived or died. Claire had cared. Claire had sold her mother's ring or let him believe she had to keep the lights on in a freezing apartment, and he'd traded that for a house full of people who wouldn't return his calls. On the 22nd day after the gala, Ethan packed the last of his belongings into 2 suitcases. 2. That was all he owned in the world, that was actually his, that hadn't been bought with borrowed money or seized against a debt. 2 suitcases and a shoebox. He looked at the pile by the door of the mansion and almost laughed. He'd started with a laptop and a folder of rejections. Now he had 2 suitcases and a shoebox. 5 years, $1 billion company, and he'd ended up with less than he'd started with, because at least at the start he'd had Claire. He heard about Victoria the same week, and the news gave him no satisfaction, which surprised him. Victoria Hayes' tenure as interim CEO of Walker Innovations lasted exactly 41 days. The company Ethan had built could not, it turned out, be saved by anyone because the thing holding it up had walked out the door with a black car and a name Ethan hadn't known. Northbridge took its assets. The remaining investors fled. What was left of Walker Innovations was carved up and sold for parts, the patents to one buyer, the engineering team to another, the office lease surrendered. Victoria had scrambled for a new mountain to climb and found she'd planted her flag on a landslide. Reyes told him about it over coffee. It was the only friendship Ethan had left, and he clung to it with a gratitude that would have embarrassed the old Ethan. "She's out," Reyes said. "The board that hired her fired her when the sale went through. There was nothing left to run." He stirred his coffee. "Word is she's having trouble finding her next thing. Apparently being the CEO who presided over the fastest corporate collapse of the year isn't the resume line she thought it'd be." "I don't take any pleasure in that," Ethan said, and realized as he said it that it was true. Reyes looked at him with something like disbelief. "Ethan, she stabbed you in the back to take your job. She called you a cautionary tale in the press. If ever a man had earned the right to enjoy someone's downfall, it's you enjoying hers." "I know." Ethan turned his cup in his hands. "But I look at Victoria, and I don't see a villain, Marcus. I see me, 2 years ago. Climbing over anybody in the way, sure I deserved it, sure the world owed me. She's just at the part of the story where you still think you're winning. I already know how it ends." He shook his head. "I can't enjoy watching someone else drive off the same cliff. I can only hope she gets out of the car before she hits the bottom the way I did." Reyes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've changed. You know that I keep waiting for the old Ethan to show up, the one who thought he was the smartest man in every room, but he's just gone." "He cost me everything," Ethan said. "I'm not in a hurry to invite him back." The money ran out faster than Ethan expected. He'd assumed in some vague way that a man who'd built $1 billion company would always have a cushion, some hidden reserve, some safety net woven from years of success. There was no net. He'd borrowed against everything spent, against everything lived, as though the river of money would flow forever, and when it stopped completely. Within 2 months of the gala, Ethan Walker, who had once flown private and worn watches worth more than houses, was counting the cash in his wallet before he ordered lunch. He moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn. 1 room really, with a kitchenette and a window that looked out on a brick wall. It cost a fraction of what his mansion's monthly upkeep had been, and it was more than he could comfortably afford. He needed work. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once, the way most of his realizations arrive now. He, Ethan Walker, needed a job. That was harder than it sounded. His name, it turned out, was radioactive. He'd assumed his experience would open doors. Instead, every door he knocked on knew exactly who he was, and what they knew was the story the press had told the ego that held a company hostage, the founder, who drove $1 billion company into the ground in a matter of weeks. Nobody wanted the cautionary tale in their building. He applied for engineering roles, product roles, anything technical, and the rejections came back polite and fast, and every single one of them contained the phrase he'd learned to dread 5 years and a lifetime ago. "Interesting background. We'll keep your resume on file." They were never going to keep his resume on file. It was on the 9th rejection, sitting in his 1-room Brooklyn apartment, that Ethan Walker finally understood the symmetry of his life with a clarity that took his breath away. 17 rejections at the start. He'd been a nobody with a dream, and 17 investors had looked at him and seen nothing, and then Claire had reached into an empire and lifted him up without ever letting him know. There would be no Claire this time. There was no secret benefactor waiting in the wings, no hidden fortune, no phone call to Northbridge. This time, Ethan Walker was actually genuinely on his own in a way he had never once been in his entire adult life. Everything he'd ever thought he'd earned himself, he now understood had been a gift. And the one time he had to build something with no gift underneath it, he had to start from below the bottom, because at least the nobody on Fillmore Street had his youth, his confidence, and a woman who believed in him. Ethan, at 35, had none of those things. He had 2 suitcases, a shoebox, and a name that made people close doors. He got the job at the repair shop by accident. He'd gone in to get his own phone fixed, the cheap one he'd bought after the good one was repossessed, and the owner, an older man named Sal with grease under his fingernails and a photo of his grandkids taped to the register, had been struggling with a customer's laptop, a diagnostic issue he couldn't crack. Ethan had watched for a minute, and then, without thinking, he'd said, "It's not the drive, it's the power delivery circuit. See how it only fails under load. Check the capacitors near the charging port." Sal had looked at him. "You know electronics." "I used to," Ethan said, "a long time ago." Sal fixed the laptop in 10 minutes with Ethan's hint. Then he looked at this strange, quiet man in clothes that were nicer than they should be for a Brooklyn repair shop, and he said, "You looking for work? I can't pay much. But my eyes aren't what they were, and I could use someone who actually understands the guts of these things." And Ethan Walker, founder of Walker Innovations, the man the magazines had called a genius, said, "Yes, I am." The pay was $14 an hour. Ethan took it. The first weeks at the shop were an education in humility, more complete than anything the collapse had taught him. He worked with his hands now, actual physical work replacing cracked screens and swollen batteries and the water-damaged phones of people who dropped them in sinks and toilets. His hands, which had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, learned the small, careful motions of removing a phone's back panel without snapping the fragile ribbon cables inside. He was good at it. That surprised him. The same mind that had once architected complex systems turned out to be just as happy solving the small concrete problem of why a 5-year-old laptop wouldn't hold a charge. But it was the people that changed him. Sal, first of all. Sal, who'd run the shop for 30 years, who knew every regular customer by name and asked about their sick mothers and their kids' report cards, who charged the old woman down the block half price because she was on a fixed income and made up the difference by charging the finance bros from the new condos full freight. Sal, who'd never made more than a modest living in his life, and who was, Ethan slowly came to realize, one of the happiest and most respected men he had ever met. People lit up when they walked into Sal's shop. In 3 years, Ethan couldn't remember anyone ever lighting up when he walked into Walker Innovations. "You're quiet," Sal told him one afternoon a month in. "Not in a bad way, but quiet, like a man carrying something." "I made some mistakes," Ethan said, working a screen loose. "Big ones. I'm still figuring out how to carry them." "We all make mistakes, kid." Sal was maybe 65 and called everyone kid. "The ones that stick with you, those are usually the ones where we hurt somebody who didn't deserve it. That the kind you're carrying." Ethan's hands went still on the phone. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's exactly the kind." "You apologize." "I did. Too late to matter. But I did." Sal nodded slowly, as if this made sense to him. "Too late to fix it isn't the same as too late to matter. Saying sorry when there's nothing in it for you, when it can't buy you anything back, that's the only kind of sorry that's actually worth a damn. The rest is just people trying to feel better." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Sounds to me like you did the real kind. That counts for something, even if she never sees it." Ethan looked at the old man. This man who fixed phones for $14 an hour and understood more about being a human being than every billionaire Ethan had ever stood beside at a gala, and he felt his throat tighten. "How'd you know it was a she?" he asked. Sal smiled. "Kid, it's always a she. Or a him. It's always somebody we loved. Nobody carries a stranger around like you're carrying this." The moment that broke Ethan open completely came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 3 months into the job. A young man came into the shop expensively dressed, the sharp, confident clothes of a startup founder or a finance guy, maybe 26, with the particular impatience of a person who has recently started making real money and has decided this makes his time more valuable than everyone else's. He had a cracked phone and a bad attitude, and he wanted it fixed now immediately, and he did not care that there were 3 tickets ahead of his. "Look, I don't think you understand," the young man said, leaning over the counter. "I have a meeting in an hour. This is my whole life on this phone. I need it now. I'll pay double. Just whatever these other repairs are, they can wait. Mine's more important." "Everybody's is more important," Ethan said, not unkindly. "That's the thing about a repair shop. Everybody's phone is their whole life." "Yeah, but I'm actually busy. Do you know who I am? I just closed a $2 million seed round. I don't have time to stand in a phone shop in Brooklyn arguing with the help." And there it was. The help. The young man said it exactly the way Ethan would have said it 3 years ago, with the same absolute unconscious certainty that the person behind the counter was a different and lesser category of human being, a function rather than a person, an obstacle between him and the thing he wanted. Ethan looked at this young man, at the confidence, at the sharp clothes, at the $2 million seed round he'd announced to a stranger within 30 seconds of walking in. And it was like looking into a mirror that showed the past. He knew exactly how this young man's story went. He knew it in his bones, because he'd lived it. The seed round would become a Series A, and the Series A would become a magazine cover, and the magazine cover would become a belief deep and poisonous, that he was better than the people around him, better than the ones who'd loved him when he had nothing. And one day, if he was very unlucky and very successful, this young man would sit across a white tablecloth from someone who loved him and slide divorce papers across it and call her training wheels, and he would think he was winning. "You know what?" Ethan said quietly. "I'll take a look at your phone right now. But can I tell you something first, and I mean this? It's the most useful thing anyone's ever going to tell you, and it's free." The young man frowned, thrown off. "What?" "You said, 'Do you know who I am?' And you called me the help." Ethan set down the tools in his hands. 3 years ago, I was you, almost exactly. Younger company, but the same clothes, the same seed round, the same absolute certainty that my time mattered more than everybody else's. I had a billion-dollar company. My face was on the magazines. And I had a person in my life who loved me before any of it, who gave up everything to help me. And I looked at her one day and decided she was beneath me. I decided I was too important for her. Ethan's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. I lost her. And then I lost all of it. And I mean all of it. And now I fix phones for $14 an hour in the shop where you just called me the help. And I want you to understand something. This job, this shop, this is not my punishment. Losing her was my punishment. This is just where I finally learned who I actually am underneath everything I thought I'd earned. The young man was staring at him now, the impatience gone, replaced by something uncertain. "I'm not telling you this to lecture you," Ethan went on. "I'm telling you because somebody should have told me and nobody did, because when you're on your way up, everybody around you is either using you or being used by you, and none of them will ever tell you the truth. So here's the truth from the only guy who's got no reason to lie to you. The people you're stepping over on your way up, one of them is the most important person you'll ever have, and you won't know which one until you've already lost them. Be kind to the people who can't do anything for you. Not because it's good business, because when everything else is gone and someday, some way everything else will be gone, the only thing you get to keep is the kind of person you were when you didn't have to be." The shop was silent. The young man looked at Ethan for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something young and scared and briefly, genuinely awake. He looked down at his cracked phone. Then he looked back up. "You really had a billion-dollar company. I really did. And you gave that speech to me, a stranger, who was rude to you." "You weren't rude to me," Ethan said. "You were rude to the help. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see it yet is exactly the problem I'm trying to warn you about." The young man was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he extended his hand across the counter. "I'm Daniel," he said. Not just a seed round, Daniel." Ethan shook it. "Ethan, I fix phones." Thank you, Ethan." Daniel pulled his hand back, and he looked shaken in a way that Ethan recognized the specific disorientation of a person who has just had a mirror held up to a face they didn't know they were making. "The other repairs can go first. Mine can wait. I've got time. I'll wait." And he went and sat down in one of the plastic chairs, this young man who'd been ready to buy his way to the front of the line, and he waited his turn like everybody else. And Ethan Walker went back to work with his hands shaking slightly because he understood that he had just done the single most valuable thing he'd done in years, and it had earned him exactly $0, and it was worth more than every deal he'd ever closed. That night, Ethan sat in his one-room Brooklyn apartment and took the shoebox down from the shelf. He opened it, the cracked phone from the Fillmore Street days, the old rejection letter, and the photograph two broke kids laughing on a mattress on the floor. He looked at Claire's young face for a long time. He didn't cry, though he'd cried plenty of nights before this one. He'd moved past the raw grief into something quieter and more permanent, a settled sorrow that he understood now he would carry for the rest of his life, and that he deserved to carry, and that had strangely begun to make him a better man than he'd ever been when he was happy. That was the cruelest joke of all, and the truest one. He'd had to lose everything. And worse, he'd had to lose her, to become the kind of man who might have deserved to keep her. The good man Claire always insisted was in there had finally shown up. He'd just shown up 10 years and a whole life too late. "You were right," Ethan said quietly to the photograph, to the woman who couldn't hear him, who was somewhere across the city in a world he'd never see again. "You said the man you married was still in there, and you said you couldn't spend your whole life waiting for him to show up. You were right about both things. He's here. And you were right not to wait." He set the photograph on the windowsill, facing the brick wall and the small square of sky above it, and he turned off the light. Outside, the city went on indifferent, enormous, full of people rising and falling, full of young men closing seed rounds, and old men fixing phones, and quiet women who turned out to hold up entire empires. Somewhere in it, in a penthouse or a boardroom or a foundation gala, Claire Sinclair was living the life she'd been born to, the life she'd stepped away from to love an ordinary man and stepped back into when he proved he couldn't love her back. Ethan hoped she was happy. He hoped it with his whole heart without a trace of the self-pity that would have flavored the wish even a year ago. He wanted her to be happy more than he wanted his old life back. And the fact that this was true, that he could want her happiness more than his own comfort, was the surest sign that the man on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment had finally fully come home. He just hoped as he drifted toward sleep in a one-room apartment that cost more than he could afford, that Claire had found what he'd never given her. Someone who saw her, all of her, the quiet and the power both. Someone who wouldn't need to lose the whole world before he understood that she'd been the whole world all along. He didn't know yet that she had. He didn't know yet about the man named Dr. Daniel Carter, the scientist who'd fallen in love with Claire, not for the empire, but for the woman who ran it, who'd looked at her across the dinner table one night and asked her what she thought about when she was alone, and actually waited for the answer. He didn't know that Claire was happier now than she'd ever been in the freezing apartment or the mansion or anywhere in between. He didn't know any of it, but he would. In a year he would see it with his own eyes on a television screen in this very room, and it would be the last lesson, the final one, the one that closed the circle completely. For now, Ethan Walker slept in his small apartment above the noise of Brooklyn, a man who had lost a fortune and a company and a name and a wife, and who had found in the wreckage of all of it the one thing he'd never had when he had everything, himself. And in the morning he would get up and put on the simple uniform of the repair shop and go to work with his hands and be kind to the people who came through the door, the ones who could do nothing for him. And he would carry the weight of what he'd lost, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, always there, always heavy, a permanent reminder of the most expensive lesson a man ever learned. Never underestimate the person standing beside you, because the person you ignore today may be the person the entire world rises to its feet to honor tomorrow. The seasons turned, and Ethan Walker's life at Sal's shop settled into a rhythm he never could have imagined for himself a year earlier, and stranger still, into a rhythm he found he didn't want to escape. He learned things at that counter that no business school could teach, and no boardroom had ever shown him. He learned the name of the mailman, Reggie, who came in every Thursday to complain about his knee and get his tablet screen cleaned for free. He learned that the old woman down the block, the one Sal charged half price, was named Mrs. Delgado, and that her son had died 2 winters ago, and that the reason she came in so often with tiny problems on her phone was not really the phone at all, but the fact that she was lonely, and the shop was warm, and somebody said her name when she walked in. Ethan started making her tea. It cost him nothing. It became some weeks the best part of his Tuesdays. "You're good with her," Sal told him one afternoon, watching Ethan patiently walk Mrs. Delgado through how to find the photos of her grandchildren for the 4th time that month. "Most people don't have the patience. They see an old lady who can't work her phone, and they get short with her. You sit down, you take your time." "She's not a problem to be solved," Ethan said. "She's a person who's lonely. The phone's just the reason she gives herself to come in." Sal studied him for a long moment. "You know, kid, when you first walked in here, I figured you for a guy who was hiding from something. Some rich guy who lost his shirt, maybe did something shady, came to lick his wounds where nobody'd look. Figured you'd last a couple weeks, and then you'd claw your way back to whatever you fell off of." He shook his head slowly. "But you're not clawing. You've been here almost a year, and you're not looking over my shoulder for the exit. You're actually here. That's rare, kid. Most people are always somewhere else in their heads." Ethan thought about that. It was true. A year ago at Walker Innovations, he'd never once been fully present anywhere. Every dinner he'd been thinking about the next deal. Every conversation with Claire, part of him had been checking his phone. He'd spent 5 years somewhere else in his head, chasing a future that was always just out of reach, and he'd missed the entire life that was happening right in front of him. It had taken losing all of it to teach him how to simply stand at a counter and be exactly where his feet were. "I used to be somewhere else all the time," Ethan admitted. "I think that's part of what I lost. I was so busy building a life that I forgot to live the one I had." The old man nodded like a man who'd heard a true thing. "Well, you're here now? Better late than never." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Lock up tonight, would you? My granddaughter's got a recital. I want to be somewhere else in my head, but the good kind watching a 7-year-old butcher a violin." And he left, and Ethan locked up the shop alone that night, and standing in the quiet after the last customer, surrounded by the small, broken things people had trusted him to fix. Ethan Walker felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, something steadier than that. Peace. The peace of a man who was finally, for the first time in his adult life, exactly where he was supposed to be, doing honest work known by his neighbors, needed for who he was and not for what he could provide. It was around this time that Ethan started to understand what Claire had meant all those years ago without ever saying it out loud. Real power never needs to announce itself. It simply exists. He'd thought she meant the Sinclair fortune, the quiet old money that owned the world without ever appearing on a magazine cover. But standing in that little shop, he understood she'd meant something bigger. Sal had a kind of power. Mrs. Delgado, in her loneliness and her gratitude, had a kind of power. The power to be fully human, to move through a small life with dignity and kindness, to matter to the people around you, not because you could buy them, but because you saw them. Claire had always had that power. She'd had it on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment when she had nothing, and she'd had it on the staircase of the Metropolitan Museum when a room full of kings rose to their feet. It had never come from the money. The money was just the smallest part of who she was. He'd been married to the largest soul he'd ever encountered, and he'd called her small because she didn't sparkle at parties. He wrote her a letter once about 8 months into the job. He didn't send it. He knew he never would. But he wrote it anyway longhand at the little table in his one-room apartment because there were things he needed to say even if she never heard them, maybe especially because she never would. He told her about Sal and Mrs. Delgado and the tea. He told her about the young man named Daniel and the speech he'd given at the counter. He told her that he finally understood what she'd done for him, not just the money, not just Northbridge, but the harder thing, the gift of letting him believe he'd earned it, and how that gift had been an act of love so complete and so selfless that he hadn't been capable of recognizing it until he'd become a completely different man. He told her he was sorry again, but differently than at the gala, without any hope attached to it. Sorry the way you're sorry to the ocean. Not because it can forgive you, but because the sorrow is simply true and has to go somewhere. And at the end of the letter, he wrote the thing he'd never been able to say to her face, not on the floor of the apartment, not in the mansion, not across the white tablecloth at Lumiere, not even at the gala, when he'd finally said sorry. He wrote, "Thank you for loving the man I was before I forgot how to be him. I'm him again now. It's too late, and I know it's too late, and I wouldn't ask you for anything even if it wasn't. I just wanted you to know that the man you believed in was real. He was always real. He just got lost for a while in a life that wasn't worth what it cost. You were the thing it cost, and no company, no fortune, no magazine cover was ever worth a single day of the woman who heated soup on a hot plate and told me I'd done it. You did it, Claire. Whatever good I ever was, whatever good I might still become, you did it. I just took too long to say thank you." He folded the letter and he put it in the shoebox next to the photograph and the cracked phone and the old rejection letter, all the artifacts of the man he used to be, gathered around the words of the man he'd become. And he closed the box. The months went on. Winter turned to spring, turned to summer. Ethan's life did not get glamorous. He wanted to be honest with himself about that, because the old Ethan would have been looking always for the comeback story, the redemption arc that ended with him back on top, richer and wiser, vindicated. That story didn't come, and Ethan slowly stopped waiting for it, and in the stopping, he found a freedom he'd never known. He was never going to build another billion-dollar company. He was never going to be on a magazine cover again. His name in the tech world was a footnote and a warning. And that was, he discovered, entirely all right. Sal gave him a raise to $16 an hour. Ethan was as proud of that raise as he'd ever been of any funding round. Prouder maybe because he'd earned it with his hands and his patience and the trust of a man who had no reason to trust him except that Ethan had shown up every day and done honest work. He made a friend of Daniel, the young founder who came back. That surprised Ethan. A week after the phone incident, Daniel had returned to the shop, not with a broken phone this time, but with 2 coffees, and he'd set one on the counter and said, "I can't stop thinking about what you said, about the person you lose being the most important one. I've got somebody like that, in my life, and I think I've been treating her like the help." He'd looked at Ethan with the raw uncertainty of a young man staring at a fork in his own road. "How do I not become you? No offense. None taken." Ethan had laughed. "That's the smartest question you'll ever ask. And I'll tell you the answer, but you're not going to like how simple it is." He'd leaned on the counter. "You stay grateful. That's it. That's the whole thing. Every time something good happens, you find the person who helped make it possible, and you thank them out loud to their face, and you mean it. The moment you start believing you did it alone, you're finished. Not your company. You, the man. Gratitude is the only thing that keeps you human when the world starts telling you you're a god." Daniel had taken that to heart. He came by the shop every few weeks after that just to talk, and Ethan watched with a quiet pride that had nothing selfish in it as the young man grew his company without losing himself as he brought his girlfriend to meet the strange phone repair man who'd changed the way he thought as he became slowly the kind of successful person Ethan had never managed to be. It was the closest thing to redemption Ethan would ever get, and he understood that this was how redemption actually worked, not as a comeback, but as a passing on taking the most expensive lesson you ever learned and giving it away for free to someone young enough to still avoid the bill. "You're kind of like a monk," Daniel told him once, only half joking. "The billionaire who gave it all up to fix phones and dispense wisdom." "I didn't give it up," Ethan corrected him gently. "It was taken. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. A man who gives it up gets to feel noble. A man who has it taken just has to survive, and if he's lucky, he learns something in the surviving." He handed Daniel back his phone screen, fixed no charge. "I wasn't wise, Daniel. I was humbled. Don't romanticize it. Just don't earn it the way I did." And so Ethan Walker's days filled with small, honest things, and his nights were quiet, and the settled sorrow he carried never left him, but grew over time less like a wound and more like a scar, a mark of something survived, tender to the touch, but no longer bleeding. He thought of Claire every day. He'd made his peace with the fact that he always would. She was woven into who he'd become, as surely as she'd been woven into the company he'd lost, the invisible ground beneath everything, the love that had built him, and the loss that had rebuilt him. He didn't try to move on, because moving on would have meant forgetting, and he never wanted to forget. The weight of her was the truest thing he owned. He didn't know as that year drew toward its close that he was about to see her again. Not in person. He would never see her in person again, and he'd stopped hoping for it, which was its own kind of grace. But on an ordinary evening, tired from a long day at the shop, he would turn on the small television in his one-room apartment, and there she would be, and the sight of her would teach him the final lesson of his life, the one that closed the circle for good. The one about what real power looks like and what real love costs, and how the greatest treasures are never the ones you can buy, but the ones you fail to appreciate until they're standing on a stage radiant and free beside a man who learned how to see them the first time. But that was still a few weeks away. For now, on this particular night, Ethan Walker locked up Sal's shop and walked home through the Brooklyn streets he'd come to know by heart, past the bodega, where the owner nodded at him, and the stoop where the kids played, and the bench where an old man fed pigeons, and he felt the strange, quiet fullness of a life that was small and honest and entirely his own. He climbed the stairs to his apartment. He heated soup on a hot plate, the way he had a lifetime ago, in a freezing apartment on Fillmore Street, and the memory made him smile instead of ache, which was new, which was progress. He looked at the photograph on the windowsill. 2 broke kids laughing on a mattress, and he raised his bowl of soup toward it, a small private toast to the woman who'd made him and unmade him, and in the unmaking, given him the only real gift he'd ever kept. "You did it, Claire," he said softly to the empty room. "You really did." And he ate his soup alone and at peace, a man who had lost the entire world and found in the losing the one thing the world could never give him back and never take away again. Himself. Humbled, grateful, and finally, at long last, worthy of the love he'd been too blind to keep. The evening it happened was nothing special, which was how Ethan Walker had come to like his evenings. He'd worked a full day at the shop, replaced 2 screens and a battery, and spent 40 minutes helping Mrs. Delgado find a voicemail her granddaughter had left, and he'd come home tired in the way honest work makes a man tired. He heated his soup. He turned on the small television for the company of the noise not really watching, and he was rinsing his bowl at the sink when a name reached across the room and stopped his hands. Coming up after the break, our exclusive coverage of the International Economic Summit, where one of the most watched voices of the new generation of leadership takes the stage. Claire Sinclair of Sinclair International Holdings joins world leaders to discuss responsible wealth and the future of ethical capital. Ethan turned around slowly. He set the bowl down. He walked to the television the way a man walks towards something he's afraid will vanish if he moves too fast. And he sat on the edge of his bed and he waded through the commercials with his heart pounding, the way it had pounded on the staircase at the Metropolitan Museum, because he knew what was coming, and he didn't know if he could survive it, and he knew he couldn't look away. The break ended, and there she was. Claire Sinclair stood at a podium before a room of the most powerful people on earth, and Ethan Walker, in a one-room apartment in Brooklyn, saw the woman he'd married addressing the world. She wore something simple and perfect. Her hair was down, and her face carried that same calm, clear steadiness he'd loved on the floor of a freezing apartment and feared on the staircase of a museum, except now there was something in it he'd never seen before in all their 10 years together. She was happy. Not performing happiness, not the bright, sharp smile Victoria used to wear, but a deep-settled, unshakable happiness that came from somewhere far below the surface. She was, Ethan realized, exactly herself, fully. For the first time since he'd known her, Claire wasn't folding any part of herself down to fit inside anyone's life. She was standing at full height, and the whole world was rising to meet her. "We talk a great deal about what wealth can build," Claire was saying, and her voice filled the room, unhurried, certain. "Companies, towers, empires. But I've come to believe the truest measure of any fortune is not what it builds. It's what it protects. Whether it protects the people who have no voice in the rooms where these decisions are made, whether it remembers the person who was there before the money, who believed in something when believing cost everything and paid nothing." Ethan's throat tightened. "I learned that lesson," Claire went on, from watching people, from watching what money does to them. I've seen good people, brilliant people, kind people get everything they ever wanted and lose the only things that ever mattered because somewhere along the way they started believing they'd done it alone. They started believing the applause. And the moment you believe the applause, you stop being able to see the people who were clapping for you before there was anyone else in the room. She paused. Real power never needs to announce itself. It simply exists, and the greatest power any of us will ever have is the power to remember on the day the whole world knows our name, who knew it first. The room applauded. World leaders, titans, ministers, all of them on their feet. And Ethan Walker sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a one-room apartment and wept quietly without shame because he understood that she was talking about him. Not to shame him, not to expose him. No one in that room knew who Ethan Walker was, and no one ever would. She was talking about him because he had become, without ever meaning to the lesson of her life, the cautionary tale she carried. And she'd taken the worst thing a man had ever done to her and turned it into wisdom she was now offering to the most powerful people on earth. He'd called her training wheels. She'd turned him into a parable that presidents leaned forward to hear. That was who she was. That was who she'd always been. He'd been married to it for 10 years, and he'd never once seen it until this exact moment watching her on a television that cost less than a dinner he used to buy, without thinking. Then the camera pulled back and Ethan saw the man. He was sitting in the front row, watching Claire the way Ethan had never once managed to watch her, with a face full of open, uncomplicated pride, the face of a man who could not believe his luck and had decided to spend every day being grateful for it. He was perhaps 10 years older than Ethan, with kind eyes and an unremarkable, honest face. And when Claire finished speaking and stepped down from the podium, this man rose to meet her, and the way he looked at her and the way she looked back told Ethan everything before the anchor's voice confirmed it. Sinclair, seen there with her husband, the physicist Dr. Daniel Carter, has become one of the most influential philanthropic voices in the world since taking a more public role in her family's holdings. Her husband. Ethan waited for the pain, the jealousy, the collapse. He'd braced for it his whole walk home, 100 nights imagining this moment. But it didn't come. What came instead astonished him. What came was relief. A great, warm, aching relief so total it loosened something in his chest that had been clenched for over a year. Because the man looking at Claire was looking at her the way she deserved to be looked at. He wasn't seeing an heiress. He wasn't seeing a fortune or a strategic advantage, or a woman who could stand beside world leaders. He was seeing her, just her. The quiet and the power, both the woman who heated soup and the woman who addressed nations, all of it at once, and he was looking at all of it like it was the only thing in the world worth looking at. That was the thing Ethan had never given her. In 10 years, he'd never once looked at Claire the way that man in the front row was looking at her now. And Ethan understood watching them that this was not a tragedy. This was the opposite of a tragedy. This was the story ending exactly the way it should. Claire had loved a man who couldn't see her, and she'd walked away, and she'd found a man who couldn't stop seeing her, and now she was standing on a stage before the whole world, happy in a way Ethan had never made her, and the only correct response, the only human response, was gratitude. "Good," Ethan whispered to the television to Claire, to the man beside her. "Good. That's exactly right. That's what she deserved." And he meant it with his whole heart, and the meaning of it, the pure selflessness of being able to want her happiness more than his own comfort, was the final proof that the man on the floor of the Fillmore Street apartment had truly fully come home. But the story of that night did not end when the segment did, because seeing Claire again, even through a screen, had cracked something open in him, and what poured out was not grief, but memory. And memory had a way of asking questions a man couldn't outrun. He lay awake for hours. He thought about the man in the front row, Dr. Daniel Carter, and he found himself absurdly wanting to know the man, not to compete with him. That impulse was long dead. He wanted to know him the way you want to know the person who succeeded at the thing you failed, not out of jealousy, but out of a strange, humble curiosity, the way a man who burned down a house might want to meet the one who built a home on the same land and made it stand. What did Carter do that Ethan hadn't? What did he understand that had taken Ethan a lifetime and a fortune to learn? He thought he knew the answer lying there in the dark. Carter had asked Claire what she thought about when she was alone, and then he'd waited for the answer. That was the whole thing. That was the entire difference between the man who lost her and the man who kept her. Ethan had never once in 10 years asked Claire a question and then been quiet long enough to actually hear what she said. He'd been too busy, too important, too full of his own noise. He'd shared a bed with the most extraordinary woman he would ever meet, and he'd never learned what she thought about when she was alone, because he'd never stopped talking about himself long enough to find out. Carter had. And that was why Carter was in the front row and Ethan was in a one-room apartment in Brooklyn, and both of those things were exactly perfectly just. The next morning, Ethan did something he hadn't done in years. On his way to the shop, he stopped at a small church he passed every day and had never once entered. He wasn't a religious man. He didn't become one that morning. But he sat in the empty quiet for 20 minutes, and he did something that resembled prayer, though he'd have called it something else. He gave thanks. Out loud, barely above a whisper, in the empty pews. He gave thanks for Claire for the 10 years for the love he hadn't deserved and hadn't kept. He gave thanks for Northbridge, for the invisible ground he'd walked on, without knowing for the gift of being allowed to believe he'd done it himself. He gave thanks for the collapse, which he'd once thought was the worst thing that ever happened to him and now understood was the thing that saved his soul. He gave thanks for Sal, for Mrs. Delgado, for the young man, Daniel, for the small, honest life that had grown up out of the ruins of the big, dishonest one. And he gave thanks hardest of all for the mercy of having seen her happy, because a lesser fate would have left him wondering, and the wondering would have poisoned whatever peace he'd managed to build. "Thank you," he said to no one, to everyone, to Claire wherever she was. "Thank you for all of it, even the losing, especially the losing." And he got up and he went to work, and he was that day more fully himself than he had ever been in his life. That evening, back in the apartment, Ethan took the shoebox down from the shelf one last time. He took out the photograph, 2 broke kids laughing on a mattress on the floor. He took out the letter he'd written months earlier and never sent, the one with the thank you and the sorry and the words about the man she'd believed in being real. He read the whole thing one more time, and then instead of putting it back, Ethan did something he hadn't planned. He walked to the window, opened it to the cold night air, held the letter for a moment, and let it go. Not out of despair, out of release. He'd carried these words for months, this last apology, this final unsaid thing, and he understood now that he didn't need to keep it anymore. He'd seen her happy, he'd seen her free, he'd seen her loved the way he never managed to love her, and the seeing had done what no letter ever could. It had let him set it down. The letter drifted away into the Brooklyn dark, and Ethan closed the window, and something in him that had been holding on gently finally let go. He kept the photograph that he would always keep, not out of longing, out of remembrance, because a man should remember the best thing that ever happened to him, even if he failed it, especially if he failed it, so that he never fails that way again. The years that followed were quiet and good. Ethan stayed at the shop. When Sal's knees finally gave out and the old man decided to retire, he didn't sell the business to a stranger. He sold it to Ethan on terms so generous they were really a gift. And he did it because in the years they'd worked together, Ethan had become the son the shop had never had. The man Mrs. Delgado asked for by name, the neighbor everyone on the block trusted with the small broken pieces of their lives. "You know what's funny, kid?" Sal said on his last day, handing over the keys. "You came in here a broken rich guy, and I figured you for a tourist, somebody passing through the low place on his way back up. But you never went back up. You went down as far as a man can go, and then instead of climbing back to where you fell from, you built a different kind of high, a better one, the kind that doesn't fall." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder one last time. "You're the richest man I know, Ethan, and you fix phones for a living. Don't ever let anybody tell you that's not the best joke God ever told." Ethan ran the shop for the rest of his working life. He never got rich again. He never wanted to. He knew the names of everyone on the block. He mentored young founders who found their way to his counter, drawn by a strange story they'd half heard, the billionaire who lost it all and chose to stay lost. And he told every one of them the same thing he'd told Daniel, the boy who'd once called him the help, and grew into a good man because a phone repair guy had held up a mirror at exactly the right moment. Stay grateful, find the person who helped you, thank them out loud to their face and mean it. The moment you believe you did it alone, you're finished. Word of Ethan's strange second life spread slowly the way true stories do without press releases or magazine covers. A tech journalist who'd once written a fawning profile of the young billionaire founder tracked him down at the shop years after the collapse, chasing the redemption angle, the fallen genius, the comeback that never came. She expected to find a bitter man or a broken one, or a man secretly plotting his return to the top. She found Ethan behind the counter fixing a tablet for a teenager who couldn't pay, waving off the charge, telling the kid to bring his little sister's phone by next week, and they'd sort that out too. "Mr. Walker," the journalist said, notepad ready. "I'm doing a piece on founders after failure, the rise, the fall, the second act. People want to know what's next for Ethan Walker. Are you planning a return, a new venture, a book?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, and it was a smile with no bitterness in it at all, which threw her more than anger would have. "There's no second act," he said. "That's the story if you want one. Everybody's waiting for the comeback. The redemption. The part where I climb back up and prove them all wrong." He set down his tools. "But I already had the top. I stood on it, and from up there I couldn't see a single person who actually mattered. So no, there's no return. This is it. This is the whole second act. A phone shop in Brooklyn and a block full of people who know my name because I know theirs. If that's not the story you came for, I'm sorry, but it's the only true one I've got." "But you were worth over $1 billion, she said, almost pleading as if he might reconsider. "You had everything." "I had almost nothing," Ethan corrected her gently. "I just didn't know it yet. I had money and applause and a house full of strangers. The one thing I actually had that was worth anything I threw away over a divorce agreement I was very proud of in a restaurant I picked because it looked out over the city." "Isaimi, Oma." He shook his head, and there was no self-pity in it, only a hard-won clarity. "You want to know what I'm worth now? Ask the old woman down the block. Ask the kid whose tablet I just fixed. Ask Sal, who trusted me with the business he built for 30 years. I'm worth more to those people than I ever was to a single investor. That's the piece nobody writes because it doesn't sell. Success isn't the story. The story is what a man does when success is taken away, and he finds out who he was underneath it the whole time." I know. The journalist wrote it down. She published the piece. It was not the story her editor wanted, and it did not go viral, and Ethan never read it. But a handful of people did quietly, and one of them, years later, would turn out to be a young founder on the edge of her own collapse, and Ethan's words would reach her at exactly the moment she needed them, and she would step back from the cliff Ethan had driven off, and she would never know the name of the man who'd saved her, which was. Ethan would have said exactly how it should be. The best gifts are the ones you give without ever being thanked. Claire had taught him that with a phone call to Northbridge and a lie told with her whole heart, and now he understood it in his bones. There was one more thing near the end of Ethan's long, quiet life that closed the circle for good. Decades on an old man now still working the shop a few days a week because he loved it and couldn't imagine stopping Ethan received a letter. A real letter on heavy cream cardstock, the kind of paper he hadn't touched since a certain gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art a lifetime ago. His hands, wrinkled now, spotted with age, shook a little as he opened it the way they'd shaken, opening the gala invitation all those years before. It was from a young woman. She introduced herself as a scholarship student, one of thousands who'd been educated through the Sinclair Family Foundation over the years. She was writing, she said, because she was studying the history of the foundation for a project, and she'd come across an old, quiet record buried in the archives of a company called Northbridge Capital and a small technology startup it had funded and later dissolved. And in tracing the threads, she'd found his name, and she'd found his story, and something about it had moved her enough to write. "I don't fully understand what happened," she wrote. "The records are careful about it. But I think a woman once saved a man she loved in secret and asked for nothing, and I think that man took a very long time to understand what he'd been given. I'm writing because I wanted someone connected to that story to know that the woman who ran this foundation, the woman whose kindness put me through school, once said something in a speech that changed my life. And I've since learned she said it because of something a man once made her feel. She said the truest measure of a fortune is not what it builds, but what it protects, and whether it remembers the person who was there before the money. I always wondered who she was thinking of when she said that. I think maybe it was you. Ethan Walker, very old now, sat behind the counter of the shop that had saved his life, and he held the letter in his shaking hands, and he wept the way he'd wept the night he saw her on the television, quietly without shame, an old man crying over a young stranger's kindness and a story that had finally completely come home, because it meant she had remembered. Across all the years, all the schools she'd built and the nations she'd addressed and the extraordinary life she'd lived, some part of Claire had carried him too the way he'd carried her, and she'd taken the worst thing he ever did and spun it into a truth that put a stranger through college. He'd been the cautionary tale, yes, but he'd also been, without ever knowing it, part of the reason a foundation gave money to children who had nothing, because a woman had learned from loving him what a fortune was truly for. He wrote the young woman back. He kept it simple. He didn't explain the whole story because some stories aren't ours alone to tell. He wrote only this: "You're right. It was me. And she was the finest person I ever knew, and I failed her, and she forgave me. And the fact that some good came into your life from all of it is the best news I've received in many years. Study hard. And when you succeed, and you will find the person who believed in you before anyone else did, and thank them out loud, to their face, and mean it. That's the whole secret. That's everything I know." He signed it Ethan Walker, a man who fixes phones, and he mailed it and he never heard back. And that was all right because the not hearing back was the point. The gift given freely, the circle closed. Ethan lived out his days in the small, honest world he'd built from the ruins of the enormous, dishonest one. He never got rich again. He never wanted to. He died many years later, an old man beloved by an entire Brooklyn block, mourned by people who knew his name because he'd taken the time to know theirs. And in his small apartment above the shop, they found very little of monetary value. A modest savings account, some worn furniture, and a shoebox on the shelf. Inside the shoebox was a single photograph curled at the edges of two broke kids laughing on a mattress on the floor of a freezing apartment so poor and so happy that whoever found it must have wondered who they were and what had become of them. And on the back, in an old man's shaky hand, were written the last words Ethan Walker ever set down, the sum of everything his one strange life had taught him, the most expensive lesson a man ever learned, and the only one worth the price. She was the whole world, he'd written. I just had to lose it to learn she'd been standing beside me the entire time. Ethan Walker signed his divorce papers, certain he had won. He was wrong about that, as wrong as a man can be. But he did not die wrong. He died knowing exactly what he'd thrown away, exactly what it had cost him, and exactly what that terrible cost had bought in return, which was his own soul recovered too late to keep her, but just in time to become worthy of having loved her at all. Never underestimate the person standing beside you. Never mistake quiet for weakness or humility for smallness or love that asks for nothing, for love that is worth nothing. Because real power never announces itself. It simply exists. And the person you fail to see today, the one in the plain dress in the corner of the room, may be the person the whole world will one day rise to its feet to honor. Claire Sinclair rose. The world honored her. And somewhere in Brooklyn, an old man who once had everything and understood nothing died, having finally understood the only thing that ever mattered. The greatest fortune you will ever hold is not the one in your bank account. It is the person who loves you before the world knows your name. Guard that person with your life, because if you do not, you will spend the rest of yours learning the hard way the most expensive lesson there is. Ethan Walker learned it. It cost him everything. And in the end, it was the only thing that ever made him rich.